Divine command theory. Morality comes from God, so killing is moral if God says so. If a God told you to kill your child, would you do it? You think the answer is obvious. Of course not. But according to divine command theory, if God commands it, it must be moral, no matter how horrific. This isn't a fringe idea. It sits quietly at the foundation of some of the most influential moral systems in human history, from ancient tribal codes to modern religious justifications for war, discrimination, even genocide. The logic is simple. What is right is what God says is right, not what feels right, not what leads to human flourishing, not what you would choose on your own, but what is ordered from above. It sounds like obedience, but really, it's surrender, not just of your freedom, but your moral compass. The classic illustration is the story of Abraham and Isaac. God commands Abraham to take his son, lead him up a mountain, and sacrifice him. Not as punishment, not because Isaac did anything wrong, just because God wants to test Abraham's loyalty. And Abraham obeys. He doesn't protest. He doesn't hesitate. He prepares the knife. Only at the last second does God intervene, saying, "Now I know that you fear me." The child is spared. But the message is clear. True faith is being willing to kill your own child if commanded. Now imagine what that kind of logic unleashes when taken seriously. This is what divine command theory makes possible. It offers a shortcut, a terrifying one. It erases internal questioning. It makes morality external, absolute and untouchable. You don't have to understand the good, you just have to obey. And that's how history starts to drown. Medieval inquisitions, witch burnings, religious wars, colonial missions that tortured under the banner of salvation. When morality is outsourced to a higher authority that cannot be questioned, all atrocities become potential virtues. There's a reason this framework persists. It removes responsibility. If the command comes from God, you're not accountable for the outcome. You're just the tool. I was only following orders, sanctified. Philosophers like Plato saw the danger early on. In his dialogue, Euthyphro, he asks a devastating question. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? If it's good because God commands it, then goodness is arbitrary. God could declare murder moral and compassion evil, and we'd have to agree. But if God commands something because it's already good, then morality exists independently, and we have to use our own reason to understand it. In other words, either God is not good, or we don't need God to know what good is. The tension never really goes away. Even today, modern moral debates around gender, sexuality, war, punishment often hide this ancient logic. People don't say God told me. They say it's just wrong, or that's unnatural, or the truth is eternal. But underneath, it's the same structure: authority over empathy, obedience over understanding. This is why divine command theory is dangerous, because it doesn't look like evil. It looks like faith. It dresses itself in humility. But in reality, it is the death of moral agency. It teaches you not to ask why, not to reason, just to submit. And once your conscience has been outsourced, you can be made to do anything. Even kill your own child with a clean conscience. Phrenology, measuring skulls to measure souls. Imagine someone placing their hands on your head, slowly running their fingers over your skull. They pause, frown, measure a bump above your ear, then say, "You're prone to theft, low self-control, possibly violent. You'll never be a thinker." They're not guessing, they're diagnosing. And according to phrenology, your skull tells your destiny. It started in the early 1800s with a Viennese physician named Franz Joseph Gaalthaar. He believed that different regions of the brain controlled different traits: courage, deceit, love, anger, and that the size of those regions corresponded to how strong those traits were in a person. So if someone had an enlarged area near the back of the head, Gal might say they were highly parental. A pronounced bulge near the temples, they might be sexually deviant. And if your skull was too smooth in certain areas, you could be written off as a lost cause. It was packaged as science. Charts, diagrams, skull maps with zones like destructiveness, veneration, and philoprogenitiveness, all based on nothing, but it caught on like wildfire. Because it gave people something intoxicating, a moral mirror, a way to judge character without knowing someone, to diagnose sin without understanding context, to measure souls, not metaphorically, but with calipers. In the 19th century, phrenology was everywhere. In the United States, traveling phrenologists would set up booths at carnivals and fairs. For a small fee, they'd feel your skull and tell you who you really were. Employers used phrenology to make hiring decisions. Parents used it to decide which child to invest in. Even intellectuals bought into it. Walt Whitman had his head read. So did Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross. Mark Twain found it amusing, but admitted some readings were disturbingly accurate, which says more about human suggestibility than science. But the real damage came when phrenology was weaponized. In colonial contexts, it became a tool of hierarchy. European scientists measured the skulls of African, indigenous, and Asian populations, and shockingly, always concluded that their own skulls were the most evolved. Samuel George Morton, a Philadelphia physician, famously collected hundreds of skulls and claimed white skulls had larger cranial capacity than black or native skulls. His findings were published in Crania Americana, a foundational work in scientific racism. Even when other scientists corrected his math, the idea stuck that your moral capacity, intelligence, and worth could be measured with a tape and a scale. Phrenology wasn't just fake, it was useful for the powerful. It justified slavery. It justified colonial conquest. It justified the extermination of lesser races. Because if your skull is inferior, your suffering isn't injustice, it's biology. In schools, phrenology was used to categorize children into intellectual castes. In prisons, inmates had their heads measured to explain, and sometimes predict, criminality. And in some mental institutions, phrenology informed treatment plans, restraints, and lifelong confinement. Even after the scientific community discredited it, phrenology's fingerprints remained. Modern criminal profiling still uses brain maps of aggression. Pop psychology still claims people are born with fixed types. Hiring software uses facial recognition to predict work ethic. Education platforms quietly push brain-based learning styles that mirror phrenological logic, but the deeper philosophical poison is this: that character is hardware, that morality is physically fixed, that people can be measured and sorted without listening to their stories. Phrenology was never just about bumps on a skull. It was about turning the invisible parts of a human, personality, morality, potential, into something measurable, classifiable, and most of all, controllable. Because once you convince society that evil can be detected by touch, you don't need trials. You don't need empathy. You just need hands and authority. And perhaps that's the real legacy of phrenology. It made cruelty feel like diagnosis, made prejudice feel like precision, and made dehumanization feel like science. Consequentialism at scale. If the outcome is good enough, anything is justified. Let's imagine a thought experiment. A train is heading toward 5 workers. You can pull a lever to switch the track, but doing so will kill 1 worker instead. If you've heard this before, you know, it's the trolley problem. Now stretch this idea. What if killing 1 saves 1,000? What if it prevents a war? What if it preserves civilization? At some point, the numbers get so big, you stop asking whether the action is wrong. You ask only whether the math checks out. This is the root of consequentialist thinking, the belief that the morality of an action depends entirely on its outcomes. If the result is good enough, the action becomes justified, no matter how brutal it seems. It's a logic that scales frighteningly well. During World War II, British intelligence cracked the German Enigma code, but didn't immediately act on every piece of information. Because if they had intervened too often, the Germans would have realized their codes were compromised. So they let certain bombings happen. They allowed ships to be sunk, people to die, to protect the bigger secret. They sacrificed lives like pieces on a chessboard, all in service of a greater victory. You might think that's war, but this thinking infects peace too. In the 1950s, Henrietta Lacks, a poor black woman, had her cancer cells harvested without consent. Those cells became the first immortal cell line used in countless medical breakthroughs. Her body was exploited. But the results were extraordinary. Vaccines, cancer treatments, gene research. So, was it justified? Consequentialism doesn't flinch. It whispers, the outcome is what matters. History will thank us. This mindset can be traced to utilitarian thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Greatest good for the greatest number. It sounds noble, until you're the minority being sacrificed. In philosophy classrooms, it's all hypothetical. But in real history, it's often horrific. China's Great Leap Forward aimed to modernize agriculture and industry. Mao Zedong's regime pushed collectivized farming, steel production quotas, and economic centralization, all in the name of a brighter communist future. The result? A famine that killed over 30 million people. The deaths were not just collateral, they were known and dismissed as unfortunate costs. The logic held, we must suffer now to build paradise later. But the paradise never came. Just graves, just silence. Consequentialism becomes most dangerous at scale when the decision-makers are far away from the suffering. A drone strike on a wedding because a possible insurgent might be there. A factory collapses in Bangladesh because the cost of safer construction would hurt profits, which fuel a nation's economy. From the top, the numbers look clean. Down below, it's mangled limbs and crying mothers. And the larger the system becomes, the harder it is to see the individuals inside it. They become data. And when morality becomes data, horror becomes a spreadsheet. You'll hear phrases like, it's for the greater good. Some eggs must be broken. History will judge us kindly, but history doesn't judge. History forgets, and systems don't feel guilt. The irony is that this logic often begins with compassion, a desire to prevent suffering to improve life, but without limits, it becomes its opposite. You'll experiment on prisoners to cure diseases. You'll re-educate minds for ideological conformity. You'll eliminate freedoms today to build a better tomorrow. And eventually, you become the villain you set out to stop, but you never see it, because the outcomes still look promising. The philosopher Bernard Williams warned that consequentialism can erode integrity. If you're always chasing the best result, you can become alienated from your own values. You no longer ask, is this something I should do? You ask, will this make the numbers look good? So ask yourself, if someone promised you a utopia but told you it required one unbearable atrocity, would you ask what it was? Or would you ask how many people would benefit? That's when you know the lever isn't the dangerous part. It's the story we tell ourselves about why we're pulling it. Religious misogyny. Woman as the source of temptation and sin. In many belief systems, the most dangerous thing is not evil. It's a woman's body, not her actions, not her words, just the fact that she exists. She bleeds. She tempts. She gives birth, and somehow that makes her unclean. This is religious misogyny, not simple hatred of women, but a deeper, systemic belief that women are spiritually inferior, morally weaker, and biologically dangerous. And what makes it especially powerful is that it hides behind holiness. Let's start with the story that shaped much of Western thought, Eve. In the book of Genesis, Eve eats the forbidden fruit. She is deceived by the serpent. She gives it to Adam. The world falls, pain, sin, death, all unleashed. And for this act she is cursed. I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing, and your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. That's not just a myth, that's a blueprint. For centuries, theologians cited this story to justify women's subjugation. St. Augustine argued that women should not be trusted to interpret Scripture. Tertullian, an early Christian writer, called women the devil's gateway. In the medieval church, a menstruating woman couldn't receive communion. A female healer who knew herbs might be labeled a witch, tortured, drowned, or burned alive. And in some monasteries, monks were taught to avoid looking at women's faces because desire was contamination. But Christianity is only one thread. In traditional Judaism, the concept of niddah, ritual impurity from menstruation, restricted women from physical intimacy, temple access, and even shared household objects. A woman on her period might sleep separately, avoid touching food, or immerse herself in a ritual bath before returning to normal life. In Islam, menstruating women are forbidden from praying, fasting during Ramadan, or entering mosques. Some interpretations prohibit women from even reading the Quran during this time. Again, the logic isn't hatred, it's purity, but purity has always been a weapon. In Hinduism, women were, and often still are, barred from entering temples during their period. In parts of Nepal, the practice of chopadi exiles menstruating women to tiny huts for days, isolated, exposed to cold, snakes, even death. And again, it's not framed as cruelty, it's framed as respect for the sacred. This is what makes religious misogyny so enduring. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It tells women their bodies are shameful, but does it gently. It teaches girls that modesty is power, but only if they disappear. And it always finds divine justification. In some Buddhist traditions, women are told they must be reborn as men to reach enlightenment. In the Japanese Shinto tradition, female presence was once banned from sacred mountain pilgrimages. In Taoism, sexual energy from women was seen as something men could absorb to gain immortality, turning women into spiritual tools. Even in modern reformed spaces, the logic remains. Why are most clergy still men? Why must a woman cover her hair to speak to God? Why are women told that motherhood is their sacred calling, but forbidden from controlling their own reproduction? It's not because they're hated. It's because their biology is considered suspicious, their sexuality, dangerous, their emotions, unstable, their independence, threatening. And when religion encodes this into ritual, it becomes invisible. A girl avoids eye contact with her priest because she's taught it's respectful. A woman refuses to lead prayer because she's told her voice might distract men. A wife stays silent, not because she wants to, but because she believes submission is spiritual. That's not oppression through force. That's belief internalized as destiny. Religious misogyny is powerful, not because it bans women, but because it redefines obedience as virtue. It convinces half the population that silence is sacred, that covering up is holiness, that disappearing is devotion. And over time, women don't just live under control, they begin to feel guilty for ever wanting anything else. Social Darwinism, the weak must lose. There's a strange comfort in believing that power is proof of goodness, that if someone is on top, rich, admired, powerful, it must be because they deserve it. And if someone is crushed, starving, forgotten, well, maybe they just weren't strong enough. That's not evolution, that's ideology. Welcome to social Darwinism, the belief that survival of the fittest applies to human society, not just to animals, but to morality, politics, wealth, race, and worth. The original idea came from Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, which described how traits in animals evolve over time through competition, mutation, and adaptation. But Darwin didn't say the strongest deserved to win. He didn't say the losers were morally inferior. He didn't say, let the weak die. That part came later. That part came from us. One of the first to twist Darwin's theory into a social weapon was Herbert Spencer, a 19th-century English philosopher who coined the term survival of the fittest, not to describe animals but economic and social classes. Spencer argued that if someone was poor, weak, disabled, or marginalized, it was because nature, or perhaps even the universe, had selected them to fail. It was a seductive idea, because if nature wants the weak to lose, then helping them is unnatural. Then charity is a mistake. Then compassion is sabotage. Then cruelty becomes virtue, because it lets the strong triumph without interference. This idea spread like wildfire through industrial societies. In Victorian England, it was used to justify the brutal working conditions of the poor. Why improve slums, feed starving children, or reform labor laws if those people were simply less evolved? In the United States, social Darwinism fed into eugenics and racist policies. It was used to oppose immigration from inferior ethnic groups. It justified Jim Crow laws. It even influenced Supreme Court rulings, like the infamous Buck Vale case in 1927, where the court upheld the forced sterilization of a woman deemed feeble-minded. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." The ruling wasn't about crime or danger. It was about fitness, biological quality. The idea that some people should be removed from the gene pool for the greater good. In Nazi Germany, social Darwinism was embedded in the state's ideology. The Aryan race was seen as biologically superior, destined to dominate. Jews, Roma, the disabled, the mentally ill, were considered unfit and targeted for extermination. Not just because of hatred, but because of logic. Cold, scientific-sounding logic. Hitler himself believed that compassion for the weak was a dangerous softness, that civilizations collapsed when they let the unfit survive. So the gas chambers were framed not just as hatred, but as biological housekeeping, cleansing, restoration. And even after the Nazis fell, social Darwinism never quite died. Today you hear echoes of it in phrases like, "Only the strong survive. Don't be a victim. If you're poor, work harder." Failure is a choice. It sneaks into economics, where billionaires are treated like gods and poverty is seen as laziness. It sneaks into education, where kids with learning disabilities are shamed instead of supported. It sneaks into medicine, when insurance systems quietly decide that some lives aren't worth the cost. Even in pop culture, we celebrate the ruthless. We idolize characters who dominate, crush, and win, not despite their cruelty, but because of it. But here's the philosophical rot beneath it all. Nature doesn't care about justice. It doesn't care about fairness or worth or dignity. If we build morality on evolution alone, we inherit indifference. We glorify power and disguise it as progress. We excuse suffering as natural. We let people die and call it fate. Social Darwinism turns empathy into weakness. It turns kindness into betrayal, and it turns success into a moral shield, so that no matter what harm you cause, you can say, "I won." That's all that matters. But if winning is the only value, then every atrocity is justified, as long as you're still standing. Hyper-Q Supremacy. Smarter worth more. Let's pretend you're 5 years old again. A stranger walks into your classroom, hands you a puzzle, and starts a timer. You don't know who he is. You don't know what this is for, but your future might already be changing. Because based on how you solve that puzzle, or whether you stare at it in fear, they'll write down a number that says how smart you are, and once it's on paper, that number begins to follow you. That's your IQ score. And for over a century, this single number has been used, not just to measure intelligence, but to define value. In the early 1900s, psychologist Alfred Binet created the first intelligence test to help identify French children who needed special help in school. His goal was humble, even compassionate. But the moment that number became standardized, ranked, and compared across populations, it was no longer just a tool. It became a weapon. Louis Terman, a Stanford professor, adapted Binet's test into the Stanford Binet IQ test and believed it could prove the superiority of certain races and social classes. In 1916, he wrote that feeble-mindedness was very, very common among Spanish, Indian, and Mexican families, and that low IQ individuals should be eliminated from the reproductive pool. This wasn't fringe thinking. It became the logic behind eugenics in the United States. In 1927, the Supreme Court ruled in Buck Vel that a woman named Carrie Buck, deemed feeble-minded, could be forcibly sterilized. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That sentence led to the sterilization of over 60,000 people in the U.S., many of whom had simply scored low on IQ tests, often due to poverty, trauma, or not speaking English. The assumption was simple and terrifying. If you're not smart, you shouldn't exist. Even now, we treat intelligence like it's a moral virtue. We admire genius. We worship child prodigies. We give higher-paying jobs, more lenient legal outcomes, and more trust to those with high IQ. And we quietly assume that those who fail in life just weren't bright enough. But here's the trap. IQ tests measure a narrow kind of cognitive patterning. Mostly logic, language, spatial reasoning, and memory under pressure. They don't measure kindness or resilience or moral imagination. They don't tell you who will heal others, start revolutions, or survive hell and build meaning out of it. And worst of all, IQ tests assume a fixed intelligence, as if your mind is a sealed box instead of a plastic growing jungle. The deeper philosophical rot is in the ranking, because once you rank people by intelligence, society starts building ladders. And when ladders are built, someone always lives underneath. Today, tech companies use cognitive testing in hiring, quietly filtering out those who don't think fast enough. Schools place kids on tracks before they know how to spell their own name. And people self-sort. "I'm just not that smart," they say, and shrink into a smaller life. The message isn't just intelligence matters. It's intelligence is you. And if your IQ is low, then you are low. You don't need help. You need to get out of the way. But the irony is devastating. Many of the people who changed the world would have failed an IQ test. Vincent van Gogh barely made it through school. Thomas Edison was labeled addled by his teachers. Temple Grandin, diagnosed autistic, was once dismissed as unteachable, and yet they remade the world. Meanwhile, plenty of people with high IQ become moral disasters, clever frauds, rationalizers of war, engineers of cruelty. Intelligence is a tool, not a compass. And when we mistake it for worth, we build a society that punishes the gentle, excludes the strange, and rewards the coldly efficient. IQ supremacy isn't just wrong, it's a hierarchy built on illusion, a caste system pretending to be meritocracy. And the moment you believe the number matters more than the soul, you've already agreed to a world where some humans are born to be forgotten. Hustle culture. Rest is shameful. You wake up tired. But there's guilt in your breath before you even leave the bed. You check your phone. Someone's already crushing goals, running a 6 a.m. workout, launching a side project, and posting about grind mode. You haven't even had coffee, and you're already behind. This is the world of hustle culture, a belief system where exhaustion is a badge of honor and rest is treated like a weakness. The mantra is simple. If you're not constantly producing, you don't deserve comfort or success, or even respect. It sounds like motivation, but it's really a moral system, one that redefines your value by how much of yourself you're willing to burn. Historically, this isn't new. In Puritan society, idleness was sin. Work wasn't just economic, it was spiritual. To labor was to prove your worth before God. To rest was to invite corruption. That belief was imported to early capitalism. The idea that hard work is proof of moral character. But then came something worse, the Industrial Revolution. Factories didn't run on motivation. They ran on human hours, and those hours had to be normalized. 12-hour shifts, 6-day weeks, children pulling levers in coal mines, women stitching in sweatshops with fingers too blistered to feel. This wasn't inspiration, it was extraction. And to make it acceptable, society wrapped it in virtue. They told workers, if you suffer now, you'll succeed later. They didn't mention that the success was reserved for someone else. Fast forward to today. We're no longer in factories. We're in open-plan offices, co-working spaces, Zoom calls, but the values remain. Every second must be optimized. Breaks must be productive. Sleep becomes a performance metric. Even vacations are branded as recharging, not because you deserve joy, but because you need to return more useful. And then there's the entrepreneur myth. The 5 a.m. founder, the 100-hour-a-week grinder, the glorified breakdown as long as it ends in profit. What hustle culture never tells you is how many of those stories end in burnout, hospitalization, broken relationships, or quiet breakdowns in bathroom stalls. Because this system doesn't care about your well-being. It only cares that you keep moving. Even psychology gets twisted to serve it. Self-help becomes weaponized, not to find peace, but to make you a more efficient machine. Be grateful, visualize success, push through, sleep when you're dead. It's not empowerment, it's indoctrination. Philosophically, this belief system dehumanizes you. You become a tool, a brand, a perpetual motion device whose worth is measured in output. But unlike machines, humans break, and when they do, hustle culture doesn't pause, it replaces them. Just scroll through social media. You'll find 19-year-olds with burnout, 28-year-olds with heart conditions, 40-year-olds who've never met their children awake, and all of them wondering, am I just not grinding hard enough? Rest becomes suspicious. If you sleep in, you feel shame. If you take a day off, you feel guilt. If you say no, you feel weak. But here's the truth. Hustle culture isn't about your success. It's about conditioning a society to self-exploit, to never question the system, to proudly carry their own chains and call them ambition. Because when you're constantly working, you're too tired to revolt, too distracted to reflect, too drained to imagine another way of living. And in that sense, hustle culture is the perfect control mechanism. It turns productivity into morality. It turns exhaustion into virtue. It turns workers into their own jailers. So if you feel guilty for resting, that's not your conscience. That's programming. Blood purity and ancestral guilt. When genetics becomes a moral crime, imagine being punished for something you didn't do, not a mistake, not even a thought, just being born with the wrong blood. Throughout history, entire belief systems have been built on the idea that purity is hereditary and that sin, shame, or danger can be passed down through blood. It's not just racism. It's deeper than that. It's a worldview where biology isn't neutral. It's destiny. Let's start with Spain in the late 1400s. After the Christian Reconquista pushed Muslims and Jews out of power, those who remained were often forced to convert. But even baptized Jews and Muslims, now called conversos, weren't trusted. So the Spanish Church created a concept called limpieza de sangre, purity of blood. It meant that even if you were Christian, if your grandmother had been Jewish, if your great-uncle had been Muslim, your blood was impure. You couldn't hold public office. You couldn't join prestigious institutions. You couldn't marry into clean families. The heresy wasn't your belief. It was your lineage. Now jump to Nazi Germany, where blood became law. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 defined who counted as Jewish based not on faith, but ancestry. 1 Jewish grandparent. You were a Mischling, a mixed blood. 2. You were labeled Jewish, regardless of your religion or culture. A scientist could have never stepped foot in a synagogue, but if their grandmother was Jewish, their books were banned, their career erased. A child could be raised Christian and loyal to the Reich and still be deported. It didn't matter who you were. It mattered what your blood said you were. This is the logic of inherited guilt, and it always leads somewhere horrifying. Because once a society accepts that identity equals danger, it begins purging itself, not just of actions, but of people. You see it in Rwanda, where ethnic identity cards were used to separate Hutus from Tutas. You see it in the caste systems of South Asia, where birth determines spiritual cleanliness. You see it in Japanese Burakumin discrimination, where certain family lineages historically linked to unclean jobs like butchery or leatherwork are still socially rejected today, even though the original reason has long vanished. The sin isn't in what you do, it's in who your ancestors were. And this belief doesn't just create oppression, it creates obsession. People start tracking genealogy like crime scenes. Marriage becomes eugenics. Education becomes segregation, and the idea of forgiveness. Impossible. You can't repent for your DNA. Even in modern society, the echoes remain. Ever notice how political groups accuse others of having bad stock, bad breeding, or weak genes? How people talk about tainted lineages, genetic decline, or the need to protect the bloodline? How immigration debates quietly imply that some ethnicities bring better values than others. It's the same superstition just dressed in policy, and sometimes it flips. In some ideologies, blood becomes not a danger, but a sacred superiority. Chosen blood, noble blood, warrior blood. This fuels nationalism, tribalism, cults of race. But the logic is always the same. You are your ancestors. Their crimes or glory belong to you. Their contamination is your shame. Their genes are your sentence. No trial, no redemption, just guilt, assigned at birth. This belief is dangerous, not because it's loud, but because it's so quietly accepted. We still say things like it's in your blood. We still treat family shame as moral inheritance. We still see purity as something that can be lost or bred. But blood is not a moral substance. It doesn't carry sin. It doesn't carry virtue. It carries iron. It carries oxygen. Everything else? That's a story someone told you to keep you in your place. Moral nihilism. Nothing matters. So cruelty is not wrong. There's a certain type of soldier who thrives in war. Not because they're brave. Not because they believe in the cause. But because for the first time in their life, they feel free. Free to do anything. Because suddenly, nothing has meaning. No one's watching. No one will stop them. No one will remember. This is the shadow of moral nihilism. The belief that morality itself is an illusion, that right and wrong are just convenient myths made up to keep societies in line. And if that's true, then cruelty is not wrong. It's just one more behavior. We can start with the philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't a moral nihilist himself, but he diagnosed it. He wrote that when belief in God collapsed, when objective moral authority was stripped away, we would be left in a void, a place where values had no foundation, where the old rules were still written down, but no one believed in them anymore. He called this the death of God and warned that, without something new to replace him, we would drift, not toward freedom, but toward meaninglessness. And in meaninglessness, the worst things can flourish. In the 1971 Stanford prison experiment, volunteers were randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners. It was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was shut down in 6 days. Why? Because the guards, regular college students, rapidly became cruel. They imposed punishments, forced humiliation, invented rituals. They stopped seeing the prisoners as equals. And once the moral frame collapsed, once the environment said, "This isn't real, this is just a study," they stopped holding back. It didn't matter what they did. Because none of it mattered. Now zoom out. Entire regimes have thrived on this logic. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia believed that morality was a bourgeois illusion, a Western invention tied to religion, sentimentality, and individualism. So they removed it. They emptied cities, killed intellectuals, banned affection. Parents weren't allowed to cry when their children were taken. If they did, they were killed too. Because feelings, guilt, grief, those were moral reactions, and in a world without morals, why should they matter? In Nazi death camps, guards often joked, laughed, told themselves they were just following orders, just doing a job. If you believe nothing is sacred, then even a child's scream becomes just noise. Philosopher Richard Rorty, a pragmatist, warned that once moral language loses its grip, once words like evil and inhuman are seen as rhetoric rather than reality, you create a playground for sociopaths. Because what can you say to someone who says, "I don't care that it's wrong. Nothing is wrong"? You can't argue with someone who believes in nothing. You can't shame someone who sees shame as a social construct. You can't stop someone from pushing people off a cliff when they think life is already meaningless. But moral nihilism doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it's just the shrug. The executive who dumps toxic waste into rivers because someone else would do it anyway. The bystander who watches a man be beaten on the street and tells himself, "It's not my problem." The parent who sees cruelty in their child and says, "That's just how kids are." It's the quiet decay of responsibility, not because people are evil, but because they've stopped believing that good and evil exist, and once enough people stop believing, the system doesn't collapse all at once, it just rots. Slowly, silently, until one day the worst acts are no longer even shocking. They're expected, they're standard, they're policy. In a world without moral truth, the only limits are force. The only law is who's in charge, and the only meaning is what you invent or what you can impose. And if you don't invent anything, then nothing matters, including you. Karma misapplied, suffering is deserved. It sounds harmless at first. What goes around comes around. You get what you give. The universe balances itself. That's how most people understand karma, as a kind of cosmic justice system, a spiritual version of cause and effect. Do good, and good will return. Do harm, and you'll suffer later. But there's a darker version, one that doesn't just promise justice, it assigns blame. In this version, if you're suffering, it's not because of injustice, bad luck, or cruelty, it's because you deserve it. Were you born into poverty? That's your karma. Disabled? Must be from a past life. Abused? You're paying off some spiritual debt. Genocide? Famine? Disease? The victims aren't just unlucky, they're being purified. This belief isn't rare. In parts of India, some interpretations of karma have historically been used to justify the caste system, the idea that people are born into their social position based on how they behaved in a past life. If you're born into wealth and privilege, it's because you were virtuous. If you're born into servitude, oppression, or degradation, it's because you earned it. And if you resist that status, if you try to rise above your karma, you're disturbing the natural order. That's how spiritual fatalism becomes social control. And it doesn't stop at religion. This logic quietly infects modern psychology. You must have attracted that energy. Your trauma is your teacher. Everything happens for a reason. These phrases sound comforting, but they carry a hidden message. If you're in pain, maybe it's your fault. In the 1980s, the New Age movement exploded in the West, blending Eastern philosophy with self-help culture. Karma got rebranded. Now it was about manifesting your reality. But the same logic applied. If your life is falling apart, it's because your thoughts are toxic. Your energy is low. Your soul is out of alignment. So instead of looking at systems or abuse or inequality, you look inward. You blame yourself. That's the trap. Because when karma is misapplied, it does two things. First, it gives power a moral shield. If someone's at the bottom, it's not oppression, it's destiny. Second, it makes the victim complicit in their own suffering. If something terrible happened to you, there's no need for justice. You're just learning a lesson. This belief makes people easier to control, easier to exploit, easier to silence. A woman who speaks out against assault might be told that she invited the energy. A starving child might be dismissed as working off their past life karma. A persecuted group might be told, "Don't resist. This is your spiritual cleansing. It looks like peace, but it's actually indifference dressed as wisdom." And when you believe the universe is always just, you stop feeling urgency to make it more just, because karma will take care of it. Eventually, somehow. And until then, the suffering continues. Unquestioned. Fascism. The collective matters more than the individual. Imagine this. You don't matter. Your thoughts. Too weak. Your desires. Irrelevant. Your body. A tool. The only thing that matters is the nation, the race, the fatherland, and if you must be broken to preserve it, so be it. That's not a dystopian novel. That's the philosophical heart of fascism. Not just a dictatorship, not just nationalism with boots, but a belief system that the collective is sacred and the individual is disposable. To understand how this idea spreads, look at Italy in the 1920s. The country was humiliated after World War I. Its economy was shattered. Its people demoralized. Then came Benito Mussolini. He didn't promise freedom. He promised greatness. The slogan wasn't "I will save you." It was believe, obey, fight, individual rights, gone, free press, censored, dissenters, imprisoned, or simply vanished. Why? Because the state was reborn as a mythic body, and every citizen became a cell in its bloodstream. You don't question the body, you serve it, or be amputated. Germany followed. Fascism there took a darker form, racial, apocalyptic. Hitler's vision wasn't just about restoring Germany, it was about purifying it. The Aryan race was the collective. Jews, Roma, Slavs, homosexuals, all labeled parasites. You've seen the photos. Rows of shaved heads, numbered tattoos, children behind barbed wire. Each one a person. Each one erased by an ideology that believed they were never real individuals to begin with. That's the horror. Fascism doesn't kill people because they're evil. It kills them because it doesn't believe they're people at all. The philosopher Giovanni Gentile, the father of fascism, said the individual is only real in service to the state. If your thoughts oppose the state, you are diseased. If your feelings resist conformity, you are dangerous. And if you're useless to the machine, you are ash. This idea is seductive because it simplifies the chaos of life. No more confusion, no more conflicting values, just one will, one banner, one destiny. And once you surrender to it, you don't have to think, just obey, just chant, just march. But what happens when the collective becomes paranoid? It starts to eat its own. Look at Franco's Spain, or Pinochet's Chile, or the fascist elements in Imperial Japan, where questioning the emperor was treason and dying for the state was a blessing. Look even at America during moments of panic. Japanese internment camps during World War II, McCarthy-era blacklists. The suspicion that anyone different might be a threat to the whole, because the logic of fascism isn't foreign. It's always lurking under slogans like safety, unity, purity, tradition. You'll hear it in whispers. We don't need more freedom. We need order. Dissent divides us. They're not like us. They're dangerous. And soon, the collective demands sacrifice, not just of your privacy or your comfort, but of your very self. You'll wear the uniform, sing the anthem, erase the parts of you that don't fit the mold. And you'll be told, this is who you've always been. But you'll feel something hollow in your chest, a ghost of the person you used to be. Because deep down, you'll know, the collective doesn't love you. It just uses you until it doesn't need you anymore, and then it forgets you ever existed. Behaviorism at its worst. Humans are just machines to be conditioned. What if everything you do, every choice, every emotion, every moment of joy or cruelty isn't really yours? What if your mind is just a box, and inside that box are levers, lights, and wires? Pull the right lever, get a reward. Touch the wrong one, get punished. And what we call a person is just a rat with vocabulary. That was the logic of radical behaviorism, a belief system that said you are your responses, nothing more, no soul, no inner self, just stimulus and response. The godfather of this view was B.F. Skinner, a psychologist who became famous in the mid-20th century for putting animals in boxes, literally. He created the Skinner box, a controlled chamber where pigeons and rats would peck levers or press buttons to receive food or avoid shocks. If a pigeon pecked the button and got a treat, it would do it more. If it pecked and got nothing, it would stop. Skinner saw this not just as training, but as the fundamental nature of all behavior: love, creativity, morality. He believed these were just learned responses to reinforcement. No inner world, no free will, just a machine reacting to consequences. He took it seriously. In fact, Skinner raised his own daughter in a version of the box, the air crib, a temperature-controlled, sealed enclosure that was meant to optimize development. Years later, rumors falsely claimed she went insane. She didn't, but the symbolism was haunting. Behaviorism infiltrated every corner of life. In schools, teachers used point systems and punishments to engineer perfect students. In prisons, behavior tokens and loss of privileges replaced actual rehabilitation. In psychiatric hospitals, patients were rewarded for compliance with candy or television and punished for symptoms with silence or isolation. The patient wasn't treated, the behavior was managed, and behind it all was the assumption that humans don't think, they just respond. In the 1960s, psychologists even experimented with aversion therapy on gay men. Give them erotic images and pair it with electric shocks or nausea-inducing drugs. The idea: if you condition them to feel disgust at desire, the desire will die. It didn't, but the trauma remained. Here's the problem. Behaviorism works. In the short term, you can train someone to say the right thing, do the right action, even smile at the right time. But it doesn't heal the soul. It teaches performance. It produces obedience. And the deeper danger is philosophical. Because if humans are just stimulus response machines, then there's no such thing as morality. Only reinforcement schedules. Why be kind? Because it's rewarded. Why avoid murder? Because it's punished. Not because it's right, because it's programmed, which means whoever controls the reward system controls the person. Governments, corporations, institutions, they don't need to convince you, they just need to reinforce you. Want people to buy more? Offer a discount. Want workers to grind longer? Dangle a bonus? Want citizens to behave? Hand out social credits? Condition the machine, and the machine will obey. Skinner even proposed a future society run entirely through positive reinforcement. No laws, just perfectly engineered consequences. Utopia through manipulation. And in some ways, we're already there. Your phone is a Skinner box. Every swipe a variable reward, every like a pellet, every scroll a silent training. You're being shaped, not by truth, but by dopamine pathways. Behaviorism at its worst reduces people to mice in a maze, tweaking their paths, never asking why they're running. It doesn't ask what the maze is for. It doesn't ask who built the maze. And eventually the machine forgets it ever wanted to be anything else. It learns to stop wondering. It just waits for the next light to blink. Predestination: you were doomed from birth. Nothing you do matters. In 1559, a child is born in Geneva. He will be baptized, go to church, speak the right words, live a decent life. But according to the teachings of John Calvin, none of that matters, because before that child was even conceived, his fate was already sealed. He is either one of the elect, destined for eternal paradise, or the damned. There is no way to know for sure, and nothing he can do will change it. This is predestination, the belief that your ultimate fate was written before you existed by a power that does not negotiate. No amount of prayer, suffering, or virtue can alter the script. It is, perhaps, one of the most psychologically annihilating ideas ever taken seriously by a society, and yet entire generations lived under it. In Calvinist Geneva and later Puritan New England, believers woke each day haunted by the question, "Am I one of the saved?" If their crops failed, maybe that was a sign. If their child died, maybe God was punishing them. But the real terror was deeper. What if nothing I do matters? This creates what philosopher William James called a moral paralysis. Because if you're damned regardless, then what's the point of trying? But humans are not built to live without agency, so people improvised. They looked for signs, clues, divine hints, not because it changed their destiny, but because they needed to believe they mattered. Over time, this mutated. Good fortune became a symbol of salvation. Success, wealth, and social standing weren't just rewards. They were evidence of being chosen. Sound familiar? This is where things get disturbing. Predestination didn't die with the Reformation. It evolved into capitalism, into racism, into eugenics, into any system that tells you some people are born worthy, others are not. In the caste system of India, you are born into purity or pollution. In racialized slavery, black bodies were said to be marked by nature for servitude. In eugenics, poor children were labeled genetically defective before they could speak. In modern school systems, a test at age 12 might decide your entire career path. Predestination is not just theological, it's bureaucratic, it's algorithmic, it's systemic. And the moment a society begins treating people as already determined, it starts treating them as disposable. Why rehabilitate a prisoner if he was always going to be a criminal? Why educate the poor if they were never meant to succeed? Why offer help to the broken when their failure is just proof of their nature? This is where predestination becomes cruelty dressed as reason. And it gets worse when the belief isn't external, but internalized. Psychologically, being told from a young age that your worth was set in stone, that you are gifted or hopeless or doomed, becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. You stop trying, or you destroy yourself proving it wrong, or you succeed and still feel hollow because it was meant to happen anyway. In either case, your life is no longer yours. It's a script, one you didn't write, can't change, and are blamed for acting out. Philosophically, this raises brutal questions about freedom. What does it mean to be a moral agent if your destiny is fixed? What happens to ethics in a world without choice? Some modern thinkers argue that biological determinism is the new predestination, the genome replacing God. Others say it's the algorithm, that your preferences, behaviors, politics, all predicted by data, shaped by patterns, locked in by surveillance capitalism. If free will is a lie, they say, then justice is a performance. Responsibility is fiction. You were doomed from the start. And the system smiles, knowing you'll believe it, because a person who thinks they are pre-written is a person who won't fight. Honor cultures, death is better than shame. In the year 1701, a Japanese samurai named Asano Naganori was ordered to kill himself. His crime: drawing a sword inside the shogun's palace, a violation of court protocol. But the reason he drew it? He had been insulted, humiliated. And in a culture built on honor, to endure humiliation without retaliation was itself a kind of death. So he struck, and missed. And then he was sentenced to death for breaking decorum, not for failing to kill, but for doing it improperly. He died by ritual suicide, seppuku, a death that paradoxically restored his honor. And that's where this story turns. Because a year later, 47 of Asano's loyal retainers did the unthinkable. They spent months plotting revenge. Then in the dead of night, They broke into the home of Asano's rival and executed him, not for power, not for war, but to redeem their master's honor. Then they turned themselves in. All 47 were sentenced to death, and all 47 were allowed to die by seppuku, because in the eyes of the shogunate, what they had done was wrong. This is the paradox of honor cultures. There are things worse than death, and chief among them is shame. In these systems, your value is not just about your actions, it's about your reputation, how others see you. And when that is tarnished, nothing else matters. Because if society sees you as worthless, then you are. This is not exclusive to Japan. In the American South, long before and long after the Civil War, honor killings, duels, and revenge feuds were woven into cultural logic. You insulted a man's family, you died. You called him a coward in public, he could legally shoot you in the street and be acquitted because he had to defend his honor. The same patterns appear in tribal societies, in Mediterranean family systems, even in prison hierarchies today. Honor becomes a form of social currency, fragile, volatile, and defended with violence. And when a society becomes saturated with honor logic, mercy begins to look like weakness. Forgiveness becomes cowardice, and negotiation becomes betrayal. Philosophers like Kwame Anthony Appiah have explored how these cultures function. They are not amoral. They have intensely rigid codes of behavior. But those codes are not based on universal ethics. They're based on appearances. What matters is not what you do, but what others think you did. And this leads to disturbing consequences. Women accused of dishonoring their family, sometimes by being raped, have been killed by their own relatives, not out of cruelty, but out of a twisted sense of cleansing the family name. Children have been forced into rituals of revenge, compelled to kill because their family's dignity was at stake. In such systems, shame is contagious. If one person is seen as disgraced, it infects the entire family, clan, or group, and the only cure is purification, often through violence. Even national politics can follow this logic. Nations that feel publicly humiliated by treaties, occupations, or global scorn often swing violently toward authoritarianism in a bid to restore pride. Think Weimar Germany. Think post-Soviet Russia. Think any country where "make us great again" becomes a rallying cry for vengeance. Because in the honor worldview, humiliation must be avenged, even if it means blood. Psychologically, honor cultures trap people in cycles of performance. You are constantly watching yourself be watched. Every gesture, every word, every failure becomes a potential breach. And any vulnerability, any admission of weakness, is ammunition against you. In modern terms, this still haunts us. Look at gang codes of respect. Look at toxic masculinity and schoolyard violence. Look at cyberbullying, cancel culture, social media pile-ons. When public image becomes moral worth, people will kill to preserve it or destroy others to distract from their own shame. And the most disturbing part. In honor cultures, suicide can be seen as noble, not because life is meaningless, but because it's less valuable than a reputation. Which means even self-erasure becomes a way to preserve social worth. So ask yourself, how much of your behavior is shaped by fear of shame? How much of your morality is reputation management? And if the crowd turned on you, would you die to redeem their respect? Honor sounds noble, but sometimes it's just another word for social control through fear. Racial biology. Inferior bloodlines must be corrected. There was a time when science claimed to measure human worth, not character, not action, blood. This was the era of racial biology, the belief that humanity could be divided into higher and lower breeds, and that these categories weren't social, but biological truths. It wasn't just racism. It was racism with a lab coat and a ruler. And once it entered the bloodstream of science, the consequences were catastrophic. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, universities across Europe and North America began to build racial science programs. Their goal was simple to prove, using skulls, skin color, nose width, and ancestry, that some humans were biologically superior. In Sweden, the government created the State Institute for Racial Biology in 1922. Its mission to study undesirable populations and protect the Swedish race. They examined the Sami people, indigenous reindeer herders, measuring their faces, photographing their bodies, and classifying them as subhuman. Many were later sterilized. In the United States, racial biology underpinned immigration policy. In 1924, the Immigration Act used pseudoscientific arguments to block immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, claiming they were biologically less intelligent, more criminal, and genetically unfit. The law wasn't repealed until 1965, but no regime applied racial biology more methodically than Nazi Germany. Hitler's government didn't just believe in racial superiority, they tried to engineer it. German doctors and scientists conducted vast racial surveys, measuring eye color, head shape, family trees, to sort people into genetic categories. If your ancestry was impure, you could be sterilized, expelled, or murdered. The Nazi Lebensborn program went a step further, breeding programs to create more Aryan children. SS officers were encouraged to father children with racially pure women. Babies born in occupied territories were kidnapped and raised as Germans if they had the right features. If not, they were discarded. Medical schools taught racial hygiene. Biology classes included eugenic theory. Even children's books told stories of pure bloodlines and the dangers of mixing. It wasn't fringe science, it was the mainstream. But the horror didn't stop with the Nazis. After the war, many of these scientists were quietly reintegrated into research institutions. The United States, for example, imported dozens of Nazi doctors and biologists through Operation Paperclip because their knowledge was too valuable to waste. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, racial biology kept evolving, just under different names. In South Africa, apartheid used racial science to divide neighborhoods, education, and rights based on skin tone and ancestry. Entire families were split apart by government classifications, one sibling considered white, the other colored, because of subtle differences in appearance. In Australia, the government forcibly removed Aboriginal children from their families, claiming their bloodlines needed to be diluted. These were the so-called stolen generations. The children were placed in white families to civilize them, their cultures erased. Even today, echoes remain. Genetic research has been used to argue for differences in intelligence between races, despite overwhelming evidence that such claims are scientifically meaningless and ethically bankrupt. DNA tests are sold as identity keys, promising to tell you who you really are, while quietly reinforcing the illusion that ancestry equals essence. Some people now try to prove their worth through blood, as if moral character is embedded in chromosomes. But racial biology was never about science. It was about control. It turned difference into hierarchy. It dressed prejudice in data, and it taught generations that extermination could be justified, as long as it was sterile, rational, and systematic. The real danger of racial biology isn't that it failed. It's that it succeeded in convincing people they weren't being cruel, they were just following the numbers. Pathologizing dissent. Belief against the system is a mental illness. There's a trick every empire learns eventually. When people resist, don't fight them, just diagnose them. That way, you don't have to silence their speech. You can say they're hallucinating. You don't have to respond to their arguments. You can say they're delusional. And you don't have to imprison them as rebels. You can commit them as patients. This is what happens when dissent becomes a symptom. When believing the wrong thing, even if it's true, becomes evidence that something is wrong with you. Let's go back to the Soviet Union in the 1960s. The regime had a problem. Some people refused to conform. Journalists criticized the government. Artists painted what they weren't supposed to. Workers demanded dignity. But the Soviets didn't always throw these people in prison. They said they were mentally ill. The official diagnosis? Sluggish schizophrenia. A disorder so vague it could mean anything. It had no obvious symptoms, except for one, ideological stubbornness. If you believed the system was broken, that was taken as proof you were paranoid. If you questioned authority, it showed a distorted perception of reality. And if you refused to be corrected, it proved how deep the sickness ran. So they locked you away, drugged you with powerful antipsychotics, kept you in psychiatric hospitals, under white lights and silence, until your resistance broke. You weren't a protester, you were a patient. This wasn't just authoritarian cruelty, it was systematic use of psychiatric power to erase political opposition. But the Soviets weren't alone. In the West, people labeled as paranoid or schizophrenic were often those who challenged dominant norms. Black civil rights leaders were portrayed in media and FBI files as delusional and unstable. Women who questioned gender roles were dismissed as hormonal, hysterical, or suffering from neurasthenia, a made-up disorder for women who didn't know their place. In 1851, American physician Samuel Cartwright even coined the term drapomania, a mental illness that supposedly caused enslaved Africans to flee captivity. Let that sink in. If you wanted freedom, that meant you were sick. This is how pathologizing dissent works. It doesn't have to be overt. It seeps into language, into labels, into how we talk about people who don't agree. A whistleblower is mentally unstable. A climate activist is hysterical. A truth teller is on a rant. A traumatized veteran is broken. An abused child with anger is defiant. The dissenter becomes the deviant. And once that label sticks, you don't have to listen to them anymore. You can medicate the problem. You can isolate it. You can call it care. But there's a deeper philosophical horror here. When dissent is pathologized, truth is no longer a matter of evidence. It becomes a matter of mental hygiene. If you believe the world is unjust, they don't need to prove you wrong. They just have to ask, "Are you okay?" They tilt their head. They lower their voice. They say they're worried about you. And suddenly you doubt yourself. You start to wonder, maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I need help. Maybe I should be quiet. And the system smiles, because it didn't have to censor you. You censored yourself. Pathologizing dissent is not about medicine. It's about control disguised as compassion. And the more society treats protest as mental illness, the more it convinces itself that the world is already fine, and the only people who suffer are those who can't adjust. So the next time someone says, "You sound crazy," remember, sometimes sanity is the silence that keeps the machine running. And madness is just the name they give you when you try to wake it up. Medicalized oppression, surgery to fix behavior. Imagine this. You're a teenager who doesn't fit in. Maybe you get angry too easily. Maybe you stare too long at the wrong gender. Maybe you cry when you're supposed to obey. So they call in the doctors. Not to ask what happened to you, but to ask what they can cut out of you. This is where medicine becomes obedience. This is where the scalpel becomes a tool of social control. Throughout the 20th century, institutions across the world performed surgeries on the brain, the genitals, the reproductive organs, to make people more normal. The goal wasn't healing. It was compliance. Let's start with the most infamous, lobotomy. In the 1930s, Portuguese neurologist Egas Muniz developed a procedure to sever the connections between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. He claimed it could cure psychosis, depression, and impulsive behavior. In 1949, he won the Nobel Prize. Then came Dr. Walter Freeman in the US, who turned the lobotomy into a mass production tool of social conformity. Freeman didn't just do brain surgery. He did it with an ice pick inserted through the eye socket. No surgical room, no anesthesia, just a hammer tap, a twist, and your personality would change forever. He called it the transorbital lobotomy. Freeman performed over 3,500 of them, many on women, children, and veterans. Some patients were depressed. Others were anxious. Some just acted out. Afterward, many became docile, silent, easier to manage. Freeman described it as cutting out the mental illness. But what he really did was erase resistance. If your behavior didn't fit society's mold, the solution wasn't empathy, it was modification. And it didn't stop at the brain. In institutions, forced sterilizations were performed on those labeled unfit, feeble-minded, or simply promiscuous. In the U.S., this often targeted poor women, black women, and indigenous women. Sometimes, they didn't even know it was happening. Young girls in state care were told they were getting routine procedures. They woke up unable to have children. Punished, not for disease, but for behavior that didn't align with the rules. In some cases, even transgender people who sought gender-affirming surgery were required to first undergo sterilization, as if identity had to be paid for with reproductive erasure. It wasn't healing, it was bargaining. The idea behind all of this? Your body is wrong if it disobeys the system. If your emotions disrupt the flow, numb them. If your gender makes others uncomfortable, restructure it. If your defiance threatens order, operate. Even today, the logic continues, just with cleaner language. Children diagnosed with ADHD are prescribed stimulant medications to help them sit still, not because their minds are broken, but because the classroom doesn't bend. People in prisons are given psychiatric drugs, not for therapy, but for sedation. Behavioral issues in elderly care are treated with antipsychotics to make patients more manageable. We call this care. But what we often mean is compliance through chemistry. And the philosophical horror is this. When healing becomes indistinguishable from punishment, the line between doctor and warden dissolves. When the goal is behavior, not understanding, the human becomes a problem to correct, not a person to listen to. Medicalized oppression isn't about health. It's about making the body obedient to the system, whether through surgery, sterilization, or sedation, and the body learns. It learns that survival means stillness, that quiet is safety, that pain must be hidden. Because if they see too much emotion, too much anger, too much difference, they might decide to fix it with a scalpel. Crusader Ideology, killing in the name of salvation. There's a belief system that doesn't just allow violence, it sanctifies it. Crusader ideology is the belief that violence, even mass murder, can be not only justified but morally required, as long as it's carried out in the name of something holy. Not justice, not revenge, but faith. And once you believe your violence is sacred, there are no limits left. Let's start with the most infamous example, the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in Clermont, France, and declared that it was the Christian duty of all able-bodied men to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. But he didn't just ask them to fight, he offered them absolution, eternal salvation, in exchange for killing. He said, "All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins." Think about that. All sins erased if you kill the right people. Tens of thousands responded. Farmers, knights, priests, children. Some didn't make it out of Europe. Along the way, many stopped to massacre entire Jewish communities, men, women, infants, because they were seen as infidels living in Christian lands. This wasn't a detour. It was seen as part of the mission. When Crusaders finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, they breached the city walls and slaughtered nearly everyone inside. Christian sources at the time wrote proudly that the streets ran with blood to the knees of horses. They weren't ashamed. They were ecstatic. They believed they had fulfilled prophecy, that their hands soaked in blood were holy hands. This is Crusader ideology, where war becomes worship, and it didn't end in the medieval period. In the 30 Years' War, a religious conflict that tore Europe apart from 1618 to 1648, armies marched not just with weapons, but with Bibles and sermons. Protestants and Catholics both believed they were doing God's work. Towns were burned, entire populations starved, civilians were mutilated or enslaved, not as a crime but as a demonstration of spiritual supremacy. Crusader logic isn't limited to Christianity. In Islamic history, extremist interpretations of jihad have led to similar campaigns, from early expansionist wars to modern-day terrorism. Groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS operate under this ideology that martyrdom through killing unbelievers isn't sin, it's the highest form of faith. They behead journalists, they bomb schools, they enslave women, and every action is paired with scriptural justification. You may ask, how do people believe this? Because the Crusader ideology doesn't work through hatred, it works through meaning. It gives people who feel powerless a story. You are not just angry, you are chosen. Your violence is not selfish, it's part of a cosmic plan. Your enemy is not just wrong, they are evil. Your rage is not a failure, it is sacred. Even in modern politics, this logic survives, hidden in rhetoric. When a politician says a nation must defend its way of life, or that a war is a battle between good and evil, they are activating the Crusader frame. Every bomb becomes a baptism. Every drone strike a sermon. Every civilian death a tragic but acceptable cost on the way to righteousness. This belief system thrives on absolutes. There is no room for nuance. No space for complexity. You're either on the side of the divine, or you are the enemy. That's what makes it so resilient. Because once someone adopts this view, you can't argue with them. They don't want peace. They want victory. And not just earthly victory, eternal reward. In this belief system, mercy becomes weakness, doubt becomes treason, and violence becomes worship. And perhaps the most disturbing part, it doesn't feel like extremism to the person holding the sword. It feels like purpose. Psychiatry as control. Diagnosis becomes a cage. Let's say someone calls you crazy. It hurts, but you can shrug it off. Now imagine a man in a white coat, clipboard in hand, says it, not with cruelty, but with concern. He's not insulting you, he's diagnosing you. And from that moment on, your words no longer count. Your actions are no longer yours. You are no longer a person, you are a patient. This is the terrifying power of psychiatry when it becomes control. Psychiatry, at its best, is meant to heal, to comfort, to offer language for suffering and tools for navigating the labyrinth of the mind. But at its worst, psychiatry doesn't cure pain, it labels it. And once labeled, you can be locked up, drugged, discredited, ignored. You're no longer suffering, you are the disorder. One of the most disturbing illustrations of this was the Rosenhan experiment in 1973. Psychologist David Rosenhan sent 8 perfectly healthy people, including himself, into psychiatric hospitals. Each one claimed to hear a voice saying a single word, empty, hollow, or thud. That was it. That was the only symptom. All 8 were admitted. Once inside, they acted completely normal, but no one noticed. They were kept for days, then weeks. One was locked up for 52 days. Their normal behavior, note-taking, asking questions, even boredom, was reinterpreted as symptoms of illness. A nurse wrote that one patient's journaling reflected obsessive note-taking behavior. Staff talked about them, never with them. Rosen concluded that once labeled insane, everything you do is seen through that lens. You're no longer a person, you're a case file. But this wasn't just a bug in the system, it was built into it. In the Soviet Union, psychiatry was explicitly used to silence dissent. If you opposed the state, if you criticized the regime, spoke of freedom, or even refused to conform, you could be declared mentally ill. The diagnosis, sluggish schizophrenia, a vague disorder invented to explain why people could seem sane but still hold incorrect beliefs. Political dissidents were sent to psychiatric hospitals where they were force-fed drugs, isolated, and electroshocked, all in the name of mental health. Their crime was thought crime. Their punishment was chemical obedience. In the West, the methods were different, but the logic was often the same. Homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder in the DSM, the Psychiatric Bible, until 1973. Women with opinions were diagnosed with hysteria. Black civil rights activists were called paranoid. Even grieving mothers were medicated instead of comforted. A diagnosis wasn't always an attempt to help. Sometimes it was a way to remove people from the conversation. And here's where the philosophy cuts deep. When psychiatry becomes a tool of control, it pathologizes rebellion. It turns resistance into symptom. It turns pain into malfunction. And it says to the sufferer, the world is not sick. You are. And once you believe that, they don't need to force anything. You'll doubt yourself. You'll question your memory. You'll take the pill, accept the label, sit in the quiet room, and tell yourself this is healing. But who gets to decide what's sane? Is it sane to work 80 hours a week in a system that burns you alive for rent? Is it sane to scream when your world is on fire and everyone else is pretending it's fine? Is it sane to be depressed in a culture that profits from your despair? Psychiatry has given millions relief, structure, and a language for suffering. But it has also become a language for silencing. And the more society lets diagnosis replace understanding, the more people fall into cages they can't see. Cages made of words like bipolar, borderline, disordered. Sometimes the most dangerous kind of imprisonment is the kind you believe you deserve. Moral exceptionalism. We are the chosen. Others are disposable. In 1637, in the early morning fog of Mystic, Connecticut, English Puritan soldiers set fire to a Pequot village. Hundreds of men, women, and children were burned alive. Those who ran were shot. Those who hid were smoked out. The commander, John Mason, later wrote that it was the Lord's will that God laughed his enemies to scorn. They weren't just killing tribespeople. They were cleansing evil. The Puritans believed themselves to be a new Israel, a chosen people. Their enemies? Pagans, idolaters, obstacles to the divine plan. This is moral exceptionalism, the belief that your group, your nation, your tribe, your ideology is not just right, but uniquely righteous. And from that conviction comes a chilling permission. Those outside the circle are less than human. This belief isn't new. The ancient Israelites saw themselves as divinely chosen. So did the Spartans, who believed only Spartan-born males were truly fit to rule. Others were helots, barely above livestock. The Romans called their conquest civilization and their victims barbarians. The Aztecs justified mass human sacrifice by believing they were feeding the gods to keep the cosmos alive. And in the 20th century, the Nazis claimed Aryan blood gave them moral superiority, and that this justified not only conquest, but extermination. Across continents and centuries, the logic is always the same. We are the righteous. They are the impediment. And when the righteous act in cruelty, it isn't cruelty, it's justice. Philosophers like Reinhold Niebuhr warned that nations often deceive themselves. They commit atrocities not despite their moral beliefs, but because of them. They think, we are the guardians of goodness, therefore anything we do by definition serves good. That's the twist. Evil no longer feels evil. It feels sacred. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't described as genocide, but as a necessary act to save lives. Even when tens of thousands of civilians, children, the elderly, the sick, were incinerated in seconds. Because the United States saw itself as the force of freedom, the exceptional nation, the world's moral compass, and moral compasses rarely point inward. Moral exceptionalism thrives on selective empathy. American civilians matter. Japanese civilians, collateral. Your city's children deserve protection. Theirs, unfortunate consequences. This psychological trick is reinforced through education, media, and myth. Children are raised with national anthems that imply divine favor. Movies celebrate one side's victories with swelling music and flatten the other side into faceless villains. Textbooks sanitize the empire building of our ancestors and demonize theirs. It's not just nationalism. Religions do it too. Christianity declared itself the only path to salvation, then burned heretics alive for questioning it. Islamic caliphates declared apostates unworthy of life. Even secular ideologies, like communism or libertarianism, can fall into this trap. If your system is the only righteous system, then those who oppose it are not just mistaken, they're obstacles to moral progress. And if removing those obstacles requires cruelty, well, that's just moral hygiene. In modern terms, this still lingers. When drone strikes kill wedding parties in terrorist zones, the logic remains. They were in the wrong place. When refugees are turned away from borders, it's framed as protecting our way of life. When protesters are crushed, it's to preserve order. Because when you're the chosen people, every wall you build is justified. Every death you cause is necessary. Every crime you commit is sanctified. Even the language betrays this logic. They're insurgents, they're threats, they're dangerous demographics, not people. And that is the true danger of moral exceptionalism. It doesn't make you better, it makes you blind. You can do the most horrifying things and never feel guilt, because the story you've told yourself is this: you were always the hero. Even when the blood is still drying on your hands. Moral purity culture, impurity becomes worse than cruelty. Imagine a child in 17th century Salem, Massachusetts. She steals an apple and lies about it. She's caught. She's punished. But the crime isn't really the theft. It's the impurity, the blemish on her soul, the rot inside. Now imagine her neighbor, a pious, upright man who accuses a woman of witchcraft. His words lead to her execution, but no one questions his morality because he is pure and she is impure. This is the twisted logic of moral purity culture. It's not about what you do, it's about what you represent. A culture of purity doesn't just value goodness, it weaponizes it. In this system, impurity becomes contagious, like a virus. Anyone who doubts, deviates, or dissents becomes a moral infection. We've seen this pattern repeat across history. During the Spanish Inquisition, people were tortured not because they harmed others, but because they were thought to harbor hidden heresy. Their inner impurity made them dangerous. Cleansing that impurity, even with violence, became morally justified. In Nazi Germany, Jews were not merely seen as enemies, they were described as pollutants. The language of rats, filth, and disease wasn't metaphor, it was justification. Dehumanization was framed as hygiene, genocide as sterilization. In the logic of purity, cruelty becomes cleansing. And the terrifying part, the more fanatically people cling to purity, the more cruelty they can excuse or even celebrate. Philosophically, purity culture is rooted in essentialism, the belief that people have fixed inner natures, good or bad, pure or impure. It creates a binary view of humanity, us versus them, saved versus damned, clean versus dirty. And this binary infects more than religion. Look at modern online spaces. A single tweet from years ago is enough to brand someone permanently impure. There is no redemption arc, no curiosity, just cleansing through ostracism. Cancel culture, moral outrage mobs, digital excommunications, these aren't new behaviors. They are ancient rituals performed in new temples. And in every purity system, the cruelest acts are committed by those who believe they're defending goodness. They don't think they're being cruel. They think they're being just. But in truth, they've stopped seeing people. They only see stains. In this system, confession is demanded. Repentance is mandatory. But even then, forgiveness is rarely offered because the goal isn't justice, it's moral superiority. And here's where it gets philosophical. In purity culture, morality is no longer about action or outcome. It becomes about status. about belonging to the right group, saying the right words, displaying the right signals. Once you fall outside that line, even by accident, you're no longer a person. You're a pollutant. And when people are seen as contaminants, history has shown what happens next. Self-sacrifice ideology, martyrdom as meaning. There's a terrifying power in the idea of dying for something, not dying randomly, not dying slowly, but dying on purpose for a cause, as a symbol. To be remembered, to be honored, to be made meaningful. And once that idea gets into a culture, into a belief system, it can turn ordinary people into willing sacrifices. You've seen the footage. A man wraps himself in explosives, walks into a crowded street, and whispers a prayer. He doesn't scream. He doesn't hesitate. Because he believes his death will mean more than his life ever did. That is self-sacrifice ideology, the belief that to die for a belief is the highest form of life. And worse, that your death has more value than someone else's life. In the First World War, millions of young men were sent to die in trenches. Not because it made military sense, but because the nations believed in honor, duty, glory. Posters told them, "Your country needs you." Priests blessed them. Teachers praised them. They were meat for a machine that had confused death with virtue. In Japan, during World War II, this became even more explicit. The kamikaze pilots were not suicidal. They were not brainwashed in the usual sense. They were trained, fed, celebrated. They were told, "Your death will defend the emperor. Your sacrifice will protect your people. Your final scream will become a song in history." Some of them wrote poems before they died. Some smiled, because they believed this was the right way to vanish. Martyrdom was the reward, but not just in war. In religious traditions across history, the martyr is often the holiest figure, the one who didn't just preach the faith, but bled for it. In early Christianity, martyrs were celebrated as spiritual heroes. Their deaths were stories told for centuries. Tortured saints, burned heretics, crucified rebels, all became symbols of divine truth. Their bodies were destroyed. Their names were immortalized. But once a culture begins to glorify suffering, it becomes dangerous to those who don't want to die. Because if death is holy, then life becomes suspicious. If you survive, maybe you're a coward. Maybe you're impure. Maybe you didn't believe hard enough. And soon, survival becomes shameful. In extremist cults, this logic becomes tight and suffocating. Take the Jonestown Massacre of 1978. Over 900 people, including children, drank poison under the instruction of their leader, Jim Jones. Why? Because they believed they were dying for revolution. Because their death would protest the corrupt world. Because dying together was purer than being left behind. Even those who hesitated were pushed. Some were injected against their will, because once martyrdom becomes sacred, choice no longer matters. All that matters is the message. This logic reappears in modern forms, in suicide bombers, political assassins, or lone wolves who live stream their crimes, hoping to be remembered. Even in non-violent forms, it lingers. In online echo chambers, young people speak of black-pilled ideologies, that the world is beyond saving, that to destroy yourself is a kind of final statement. Death becomes a brand, a protest, a way to mean something, and it's seductive, because when your life feels meaningless, martyrdom gives it structure. No more ambiguity, no more confusion, just, I suffer, therefore I matter. Philosopher Albert Camus warned that the human being is the only creature who refuses to be what he is. And in that refusal, we search for causes so intense they're worth dying for, because nothing else feels real. But when everyone wants to die for something, no one's left to live with the consequences. Martyrdom feels pure. But it often leaves behind a trail of blood, grief, and children too young to understand why their parents chose death over them. So before you glorify the one who died for the cause, ask who told them that was the highest good. Ask who survives. ask what systems rise from the ashes. Because not all martyrs are heroes. Some are just victims of a belief system that mistook destruction for meaning. Totalitarian communism. When the state becomes your mind, you wake up in a gray room, the same as yesterday, the same as everyone else's. Your clothes are gray. Your thoughts are gray. Even your dreams feel assigned. You are not poor. You are not hungry. You are not free. And you don't remember what freedom felt like, only that you were told it was dangerous. That's the architecture of totalitarian communism. Not the dream Marx wrote about, not the shared ownership of means and equality of condition. No, this is what happens when that dream is seized by a state that doesn't tolerate dreams. Let's be clear. The original idea of communism was about liberation, to end exploitation, to abolish class, to make the worker free. But in the 20th century, something terrifying happened. The state that was supposed to be a temporary vehicle to help people transition into freedom became permanent, and then it became God. Start with Stalin's Soviet Union. From 1924 to 1953, over 20 million people were executed, starved, imprisoned, or sent to gulags. The crime, often nothing. Sometimes owning a cow, sometimes saying the wrong thing, sometimes thinking it. Because in a totalitarian communist regime, intent is crime, doubt is betrayal. And your mind is not yours. You must think what the party thinks. No more private ambition. No more religious belief. No more family ties stronger than the state. In Stalin's Russia, children were encouraged to report their own parents. In Mao's China, during the Cultural Revolution, students beat their teachers to death for quoting outdated ideology. They called it purification. The goal wasn't to control your actions. The goal was to control your consciousness. George Orwell didn't invent this in 1984. He borrowed it from real purges. Real re-education. Real public confessions where people sobbed, not from guilt, but because they had been broken into confessing beliefs they never had. This was thought reform, psychological torture masquerading as progress, and it worked. Because when every book, every newspaper, every movie, every school, and every neighbor tells you the same thing, or at least you forget how to resist. Take North Korea today. A closed society ruled by a hereditary God state. Children are taught that the leader never defecates, that he invented the hamburger, that if you speak against him, not only you, but your entire family for 3 generations will disappear, and the people believe it. Because disbelief is suicide, because reality is curated by the state. This isn't about economics anymore. It's not even about oppression in the traditional sense. It's about replacement, replacing your thoughts with state-approved thoughts. Replacing your identity with state-approved roles, replacing your past with a rewritten one. Because if you control the past, you control the future. And if you control the mind, you don't need chains. You can walk freely in a prison you've forgotten how to see. There's no protest, no revolt. Because revolt requires a self, and the self has been erased. You are the state is you, and you vanish at the same moment it commands it. Biological determinism. You are your genes. What if you were already sentenced from the moment you were conceived? That's the quiet horror of biological determinism, the belief that your DNA controls everything that matters about you. Your intelligence, your ambition, your morality, even your potential to commit crime. It sounds like science, but it's really fate in disguise. Let's start with the surface appeal. We've all heard it. She's just naturally gifted. He was born with a temper. They come from strong stock. Or the opposite, he was doomed from the start. Biological determinism takes these everyday comments and turns them into policy, into ideology, into cages. In the early 20th century, this belief was used to explain why some people were poor, violent, or unfit. The answer, according to eugenicists, was simple: bad genes. That belief justified everything from forced sterilization to institutionalization. But it didn't stop there. Even today, determinism slips into how we treat children. In some schools, genetic testing is used to predict academic potential. Students are quietly funneled into advanced tracks or remedial ones, based not on performance but on what their genes suggest they might do someday. In 2018, a study proposed a polygenic score that could predict educational achievement based on DNA. The implication: maybe we don't need to waste resources on kids whose genes say they'll never make it. In criminal justice, the same thinking persists. The warrior gene, MAOA, has been linked in some studies to aggression and violence. In courtrooms, defense teams have argued that their client's genetic makeup reduced their culpability for murder. It wasn't really his fault, it was biology. And on the flip side, if someone's genes suggest future violence, do we preemptively lock them up? This is Minority Report, but without the psychic visions, just a cheek swab. It gets worse when it comes to mental illness. For decades, schizophrenia was treated not as a complex condition, but as a genetic curse. Families were told they carried bad blood. Some were sterilized, others institutionalized for life. The assumption wasn't just that you might develop the illness, but that you were the illness. Biological determinism turns risk into identity. It collapses possibility into prediction. It erases choice while still holding you accountable for outcomes you never got to control. And underneath it all is a philosophical betrayal. Because to believe in biological determinism is to abandon free will while still pretending to honor it. We punish people for failing to be good while quietly assuming their biology made it impossible to begin with. We claim to believe in education, transformation, redemption, but determinism whispers that it's all an illusion, that no amount of struggle can overcome your neural wiring, that effort is theater, that selfhood is a script already written. And this belief isn't confined to science labs or courtrooms, it's inside you. When you say, "I just can't help it, I'm wired this way," where did that idea come from? When you decide someone else is just born selfish or built for greatness or genetically unlucky, whose story are you repeating? Biological determinism is comforting in a way. It promises simplicity. It removes the burden of uncertainty, but it replaces it with chains. It turns people into meat puppets, dancing to genetic tunes they never asked to hear. And yet, ironically, it's also a lie. Modern science shows that genes are probabilistic, not deterministic. Environment, randomness, experience, they all matter. Even the most heritable traits are shaped by context. But belief isn't about truth. It's about what power wants to be true, and power loves determinism. Because if people are nothing more than flesh algorithms, then no one can protest their place in the hierarchy. They are where they belong. Not because of history, not because of oppression, but because their DNA told them to sit there. And that is the most elegant form of control, the cage you think you were born inside. Utilitarian slippery slopes. When you start calculating lives like numbers, if killing one person would save 10, would you do it? Most people hesitate. But what if it's one child, and the 10 are scientists who could cure cancer? Or one elderly patient to free up 10 ICU beds? Welcome to the utilitarian slope, where morality becomes math, where lives are equations, and compassion gets replaced by calculators. Utilitarianism, at its core, seems noble. It says, do the greatest good for the greatest number. Simple, logical, fair. But here's the problem. What happens when the numbers lie? Take the classic trolley problem. A train is hurtling toward 5 people. You can pull a lever and divert it, but it will kill one person on the other track. If you believe in pure utilitarian logic, you pull the lever, you save 5, sacrifice 1. It's math. But real life isn't a trolley, and real people aren't anonymous stick figures. Let's get darker. During World War II, the British government let entire towns be bombed, civilians, families, children, because they had cracked the German Enigma code and didn't want the Nazis to know. If they evacuated the towns, the secret would be exposed. So they let them die, because the war could be won faster, because the outcome was greater. And it worked, but no one asked the children in Coventry how it felt to be part of the equation. In medicine, utilitarian logic sometimes becomes clinical coldness. A hospital has 1 liver and 5 patients who need transplants. One patient could donate organs that would save all 5. Should they be sacrificed? In theory, maybe. In practice, that's murder. But the slope begins when we stop seeing people as individuals, when we turn them into data, risk factors, efficiency scores. China's one-child policy was built on utilitarian math. Too many people, famine, poverty, collapse. Solution: limit births. The result: forced abortions, infanticide, missing daughters, an entire generation shaped by a number. That's the cost of maximizing good when good is defined from above. Utilitarianism has no room for sanctity. It doesn't believe in sacred things, only in outcomes. If surveillance makes people safer, then privacy is expendable. If silencing dissent prevents riots, then free speech is a threat. If your suffering prevents mass panic, then your pain is acceptable. You're a statistic, not a soul. And once that logic sets in, it doesn't stop, because once you've justified one small cruelty for the greater good, the second one is easier, and the third, until you're not calculating anymore, you're just following the formula. Philosopher Bernard Williams called this the problem of integrity. He warned that utilitarianism erases the moral weight of the individual, that in saving everyone, you might lose yourself. Who are you if your values can be overridden by a spreadsheet? Who are you if 1,000 lives mean more than the one you love? There's no room for love in a moral calculator. No space for guilt, grief, or hesitation. Only results. So ask yourself, if the math tells you to betray a friend, would you? If the math says one child must be tortured so millions can prosper, would you nod and say, it's for the best? Because if you do, you're not a person anymore. You're just the lever. Colonial civilizing ideologies. They didn't call it conquest, they called it enlightenment. They didn't call it slavery, they called it uplifting the savage. They didn't say you will serve us, they said you will thank us. This is the horror of colonial civilizing ideologies, the belief that violence is kindness, that theft is salvation, that extermination is moral progress. The French called it la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. The British spoke of the white man's burden. The Spanish cloaked it in Catholic guilt and divine purpose. But the formula was always the same. Step 1. Declare an entire population uncivilized. Step 2. Use that as the moral justification to erase their culture, take their land, enslave their bodies, and tell them it's for their own good. In Congo under Belgian rule, King Leopold claimed to be liberating the Africans from Arab slave traders. In reality, he ran one of the most brutal forced labor regimes in human history. Villages were burned, hands were chopped off as punishment quotas. Children were taken hostage to force their fathers into rubber harvesting. All of it documented in the name of progress. Here's the deeper trick. These atrocities didn't need to be hidden because they were believed to be righteous. Even in America, manifest destiny was portrayed as the spread of light across darkness. Never mind the trail of broken treaties, destroyed nations, and cultural genocide. Native American children were torn from their families and sent to residential schools. There, their hair was cut, their languages beaten out of them, and their identities forcibly rewritten. The official slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." That wasn't some underground doctrine. That was U.S. federal policy. The most horrifying part is that this wasn't done in secret. It was printed in newspapers, praised in parliaments, taught to children in textbooks, because that's what ideology does. It makes evil feel benevolent. If you believe your victims are less evolved, if you believe their culture is a disease, if you believe that civilization only counts when it looks like yours, then you can do anything to them. Strip their language. It's for efficiency. Ban their religion. It's for their salvation. Work them to death on plantations or in mines. It's economic development. This isn't just in the past. Modern versions still echo today. When aid comes with strings that rewrite entire economies, when entire regions are bombed under the banner of liberation, when military occupation is justified as democracy building, when indigenous knowledge is dismissed as myth and only Western science is considered truth. All of it rooted in the same assumption: we are more human than you. Philosopher Aimé Césaire put it this way: colonialism works by decivilizing the colonizer. It brutalizes him and degrades him. Because once you've trained yourself to smile while conquering, once you've taught your children to see extermination as moral duty, you've infected yourself with something deeper than cruelty. You've convinced yourself that domination is compassion. And you'll never see the blood on your hands, because it's hidden under the white gloves of righteousness. Asceticism is power. Suffering proves moral superiority. There's a kind of belief that doesn't just tolerate pain, it turns pain into status. Asceticism, the deliberate rejection of pleasure, comfort, indulgence, often begins with spiritual intent. A monk refuses luxury to purify the soul. A hermit fasts to discipline the body. A mystic sleeps on stone to escape desire. But over time, something shifts. The suffering becomes more than a means. It becomes identity, and worse, superiority. In many traditions, the holiest figures are not the ones who help others, but the ones who suffer the most. The more ragged the clothes, the more extreme the deprivation, the more removed from ordinary life, the more revered they become. It starts in isolation, caves, deserts, mountaintops. But eventually, it becomes performance. Stories of medieval Christian saints tell of women who starved themselves until they stopped menstruating, men who refused to bathe for decades, people who wore chains under their robes to inflict constant pain, all to subdue the flesh. These weren't fringe lunatics. They were held up as models of virtue. Even those who witnessed their suffering believed it proved spiritual greatness, that to be closer to God, one must be farther from the body, and the farther you go, the more you leave behind warmth, food, sleep, sex, companionship, the more sacred you must be. In Hinduism and Jainism, some ascetics walk barefoot over burning sands. Some pull carts with hooks through their skin. Some choose silence for years, never speaking a word. Some renounce all possessions, even clothing, wandering the world naked, starving, unseen, not because they hate life, because they've been taught that to need less is to be more. But what happens when that idea spreads? What happens when asceticism becomes ideology, not a private discipline, but a public expectation? You get systems that glorify suffering. You get societies where poverty is seen as proof of virtue, where indulgence is sin, where pleasure is weakness, where joy itself becomes suspicious. And you get power structures where those who suffer the most are told they're better than everyone else, simply because they suffer. Even in modern times, you see this in unexpected places. In military culture, where hardship is valorized above reason. In corporate hustle culture, where burnout is framed as dedication. In elite education, where sleep deprivation becomes a symbol of how hard you're trying. You see it in parenting, in politics, in activism, where whoever gives up the most, sleeps the least, eats the worst, sacrifices the hardest, is seen as the most committed, the most moral. But asceticism has a secret. It doesn't kill ego. It feeds it. Because once suffering becomes a badge of honor, it creates a quiet hierarchy. You suffer more, you're better. You sacrifice more, you're more pure. You silence your needs more completely, you win. And suddenly, the point isn't transcendence. It's domination by denial. This belief system teaches that strength is not found in kindness or compassion, but in the ability to endure pain without complaint, that the highest humans are those who can vanish most completely from pleasure, comfort, or even existence. But this isn't enlightenment. It's a slow erasure of the self, worn as a crown. Moral relativism in wartime. Anything becomes permissible. In 1943, a group of young German soldiers rounded up civilians in the Polish village of Józefów. Most were women, children, and the elderly. They were not armed. They posed no threat. And yet, they were shot, one by one, at close range, by men who weeks earlier had been barbers, salesmen, and fathers. How does this happen? The answer isn't sadism. It's something colder: context collapse. When the world enters war, morality doesn't disappear. It becomes pliable. It shifts, morphs. Good and evil are no longer absolutes. They're recalibrated by uniforms, flags, and commands. And this is the disturbing truth. War makes morality relative and then rewards it. Let's be clear. Soldiers are not born killers. Most people left to themselves don't want to shoot strangers. In fact, historian Dave Grossman found that during World War II, the vast majority of soldiers deliberately missed their targets. The instinct not to kill was strong, so militaries had to adapt. They trained out hesitation. They introduced psychological reframing. The enemy is less than human, a rat, a cockroach, a threat to your family. And suddenly, pulling the trigger becomes virtue. Because in war, killing becomes moral, if it's the right enemy. Philosophers have wrestled with this. The ancient Greeks celebrated war as noble. Thucydides recorded how Athenian generals justified massacres by invoking strategic necessity. In medieval Europe, the Church created the concept of a just war, as if divine rules could make slaughter acceptable. In modern times, international law tries to draw lines: civilian versus combatant, proportional response, war crimes. But those lines blur fast when bullets fly. Consider this: the firebombing of Tokyo killed more civilians than either atomic bomb. It was deliberate. It was strategic, and no one was tried for it. Because when you win, relativism becomes righteousness. This is the psychological trick of wartime. You are not committing murder. You are serving a cause. You are protecting your people. You are obeying orders. It's not just the soldiers, either. At home, populations cheer drone strikes they'll never see. Children learn to see enemies on maps. Propaganda reframes everything. Violence is framed as peacekeeping, invasion as liberation, collateral damage as unfortunate necessity. Even torture becomes acceptable, so long as it's for the greater good. This isn't just strategic, it's existential. In war, moral clarity is dangerous. If soldiers began to question, to hesitate, to empathize, they would fall apart. So war cultivates selective empathy. Your own dead are mourned. Theirs are statistics, and over time this doesn't just affect soldiers, it rewires entire societies. Think of how language changes. Civilians become soft targets. A child becomes a high-value proximity. Villages become zones. This is moral relativism as linguistic anesthesia. It numbs the conscience so the machine can run, but the aftermath always arrives. In 1946, many of those same German policemen who executed civilians broke down. Not because they were caught, but because the war was over and the moral frame had snapped back. Without the pressure of orders, without the fog of mission, they saw it clearly, and it destroyed them. This is the trap of moral relativism in wartime. It works until it doesn't. It gives people permission until the silence returns. And then the horror is no longer outside, it's inside. Philosophically, the most disturbing part is this: most people are not evil, they are context sensitive. They will do what feels normal, what feels expected, what seems justified by the moment, and war reshapes the moment entirely. Which means, if placed in the right uniform, under the right orders, with the right fear, you might have done it too. That is the disturbing truth. Not that evil exists, but that it can be authorized, and once it is, anything becomes permissible. End times exploitation. No future, so no responsibility. What if you were told the world was ending, soon, not in 1,000 years? Not in some distant apocalypse, but in your lifetime. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next year, maybe now. And what if the people telling you this didn't want to prepare you? They wanted to use you. This is end times exploitation, the use of apocalyptic belief to control behavior, suppress resistance, and destroy any vision of a future worth fighting for. It works like this. If the world is about to end, then nothing else matters. Not education, not justice, not long-term consequences, not your body, not your freedom, just obedience. You see this strategy in cults, religious sects, even in mainstream movements, all using the looming shadow of doom to shrink your timeline until all that exists is the present moment, and whoever claims to speak for God. Let's start with the Branch Davidians, led by David Koresh in the 1990s. He told his followers that the end was coming, that the apocalypse would arrive at any moment. So they moved into a compound in Waco, Texas, stockpiled weapons, cut off contact with outsiders, and waited. When the U.S. government raided the compound in 1993, the siege ended in flames, 76 people dead, including children. They had been taught the world would end in fire, and it did. Then there was Heaven's Gate, a cult that believed the earth was about to be recycled, wiped clean. They were told that only those who transcended their human bodies would be saved, that salvation waited aboard a spaceship behind the Hale-Bopp comet. In 1997, 39 people committed ritual suicide, dressed in matching clothes, lying peacefully in bunk beds, convinced that death was escape, because when the end is coming, the present becomes disposable. But it's not just fringe groups. Many fundamentalist Christian groups preach that Jesus will return at any moment, that the earth will be destroyed in fire, the faithful lifted into the sky. In 2011, evangelical broadcaster Harold Camping predicted the exact day of the rapture. Billboards went up. Families sold their homes. Some emptied their children's college funds. The date came. Nothing happened. But the belief stayed, and it serves a purpose. If you believe the world is about to end, you're less likely to demand justice, less likely to organize, less likely to build systems that last. Why fix the world when it's about to be erased? This is the key to end times exploitation. It short-circuits hope. It tells you not to plan, not to resist, not to care. In politics, this logic is used to block climate action. The end is coming anyway. Why bother saving the planet? In education, it's used to discourage science, curiosity, long-term thinking. In religion, it's used to keep believers compliant, focused on surviving the final judgment, rather than questioning the present injustice. And for those in power, this is convenient. A population focused on the afterlife doesn't ask too many questions about this life. A culture convinced the end is near doesn't demand reform. A mind obsessed with Armageddon is easier to distract, to isolate, to control. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once said that despair is not the absence of hope, it's the refusal to hope. End times exploitation cultivates that despair. It replaces imagination with submission. It kills the future in the name of prophecy. And once people believe the world is already ending, they'll stop trying to make it better. Nationalism. The nation becomes sacred. Outsiders are filth. It begins with something familiar, a flag, a story, a shared memory of struggle. You're told your homeland is special, forged in blood, triumph, sacrifice. Its values are noble, its people are chosen, its history is a source of pride. This is nationalism in its most seductive form, the belief that your nation is not just important, it's sacred. And once something becomes sacred, it becomes unquestionable. Nationalism isn't the same as patriotism. Patriotism is love. Nationalism is worship. It doesn't just celebrate your country, it demands loyalty, not to its people, not to its principles, but to its identity, its myth, its absolute moral right to exist, above all else. In this belief system, the nation isn't just a place, it's a body, a soul, a living organism, and you are one of its cells. If you strengthen it, you are a hero. If you weaken it, you are a disease. This is how nationalism transforms ordinary humans into enemies of the state, not because of what they do, but because of who they are. Minorities, immigrants, critics, people who don't match the dominant ethnicity, religion, language, or ideology. Nationalism frames them not as fellow citizens, but as threats to purity, a cancer on the homeland. And so their removal becomes an act of healing. You've seen this before. In Nazi Germany, the idea of a pure Aryan race led to the extermination of millions. In Rwanda, nationalist propaganda painted Tutsis as cockroaches, and that metaphor was taken literally with machetes. In Serbia, ethnic cleansing became a term used in official documents, not war crimes, just hygiene. Conversion by fear. You're told to believe, not because it brings peace, but because the alternative is unbearable. Burning, torture, eternal agony, social exile, divine wrath. This is conversion by fear. The use of terror, physical or spiritual, to force belief. It's not persuasion. It's submission under threat. And it's been practiced and perfected by civilizations, empires, and religious institutions for thousands of years. Let's start with the early Christian expansion in Europe. After Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it was no longer spread by persuasion alone. In many regions, pagan temples were destroyed, sacred groves cut down, statues smashed. Those who refused baptism were punished, some with taxes, some with banishment, some with death. In the 8th century, Charlemagne gave the Saxons a choice: convert to Christianity or die. His campaign included forced baptisms, executions, and the destruction of indigenous religion. In one infamous incident, over 4,500 Saxons were executed in a single day for refusing to abandon their gods. The logic wasn't subtle: salvation or slaughter. The same structure appears in the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Conquistadors arrived with Bibles in one hand and swords in the other. Indigenous peoples were offered Catholicism, not as a gift, but as a command. Entire populations were baptized en masse, under threat. Those who resisted were labeled heathens, fit for enslavement or extermination. This wasn't about spiritual awakening. It was compliance or death. Even when physical violence wasn't used, the fear was no less intense. In medieval Europe, the doctrine of eternal hellfire was not a metaphor. It was described in detail: lakes of fire, gnashing of teeth, worms that never die. Sermons were not designed to inspire. They were engineered to terrify. Children were taught that one impure thought, one failed confession, one missed sacrament could doom them forever. Entire generations were emotionally blackmailed into belief. And when heresy emerged, any deviation from doctrine, the response was swift and brutal. The Inquisition perfected psychological torture. Suspected heretics were interrogated, imprisoned, mutilated, unless they confessed. And once they did, they were burned alive, in public squares as a warning to others. Confess or burn, believe or suffer. Even in Islam, similar patterns emerge in certain regimes and periods. While the Quran says there is no compulsion in religion, history tells a more complicated story. Under the Ottoman Empire, non-Muslims paid extra taxes and were excluded from political power. Conversion wasn't always forced, but strongly incentivized. In more extremist settings like under ISIS, conversion was demanded at gunpoint. In every case, belief was reduced to a survival strategy. Say the words. Pray the prayers, not because you believe them, but because you're terrified not to. And once fear enters the bloodstream of faith, everything changes. God stops being a source of love. He becomes a warden, a spy, a tyrant waiting for you to slip. This belief system doesn't just control people, it rewires them. Even after the violence ends, the fear remains, lodged in the psyche. Adults still feel anxious over childhood doubts. Survivors of religious trauma report nightmares of hell decades later. Former believers still whisper, "What if it's true?" even when they've long stopped believing. That's the final cruelty of conversion by fear. It doesn't require belief, just obedience, just silence, just the right words, spoken under pressure while your soul stays paralyzed underneath. Because when belief is born from terror, it's no longer faith. It's a hostage situation. Apocalyptic thinking. Destroy the world to purify it. There's a belief system that doesn't just expect the end of the world, it celebrates it. Apocalyptic thinking is the idea that the world is not only doomed, but that its destruction is necessary, that history is a countdown, that suffering is a signal, that catastrophe is cleansing. And for some, the only thing more dangerous than the end is the idea that it's not happening fast enough. You've seen versions of this belief throughout history, in religion, in cults, in politics. It begins with a simple claim: the world is corrupt, fallen, unworthy, and something massive, divine, cosmic, final, is coming to wipe it clean. But the twist, that's a good thing. Let's go back to 17th century England during a time of civil war, plague, and political chaos. A man named Thomas Müntzer began preaching that the end of days was near and that God would destroy the rich, the powerful, and the unfaithful. His followers believed they were the chosen instruments of divine justice. They didn't wait for the end. They tried to cause it. Müntzer helped ignite the Peasants' War, one of the bloodiest uprisings in early modern Europe. Tens of thousands died, not because they believed in change, but because they believed change meant apocalypse. You see this again in the Millerite movement in 1844 America. Followers sold their homes, abandoned families, and gathered on hilltops waiting for the world to end. When it didn't, some spiraled into despair. Others simply adjusted the date. The world didn't need to end right now, just soon. Soon enough to matter. Soon enough to keep believing. Apocalyptic thinking gives people a way to frame chaos as destiny. When the economy collapses, when war erupts, when disease spreads, it's not random, it's not tragic, it's confirmation. This logic is so seductive because it gives meaning to destruction. It makes pain into prophecy. It makes collapse feel sacred. And most dangerously, it gives some people permission to accelerate it. Modern terrorist groups like ISIS believed in a literal apocalypse, that a final, world-ending battle would take place in a small Syrian town called Dabiq. They framed every act of brutality as a way to hasten the end. Beheadings, slavery, suicide bombings, all presented as steps toward divine fire. Even in politics, apocalyptic language creeps in. Leaders talk about final battles, point of no return, existential threats. Supporters are told this election, this war, this moment is everything, that if the other side wins, the world ends. And once you believe that, nothing is off limits. Apocalyptic thinking removes the need for compromise, for patience, for empathy. Because there's no point fixing a burning house, you just wait for it to collapse or throw gasoline. In cults, this mindset becomes even more toxic. Groups like Heaven's Gate convinced followers that the physical world was evil and that salvation required death. They dressed in matching clothes, took poison together, and died believing they were boarding a spaceship hidden behind a comet. They didn't fear death. They feared missing it. That's the cruelty of this belief system. It doesn't just predict destruction, it makes people desire it. And when enough people want the world to end, some of them will start looking for ways to help it along. Militarism. War is not a means, but an identity. Some belief systems don't just accept war, they worship it. Militarism is the idea that war is not just a necessary evil, it's noble, cleansing, strengthening. That violence isn't a failure of diplomacy, but its evolution, that the battlefield is where character is forged, nations are born, and weakness is erased. Under this belief, peace is not the goal. Peace is decay. Militarism doesn't need war to survive. It needs the threat of war, the constant preparation for it, the reverence for it. The idea that every citizen should be a soldier, every choice a battle, every neighbor a potential enemy. It's not always declared openly. It doesn't always wear medals, but it shapes cultures, economies, and identities, quietly, pervasively, violently. In militaristic societies, soldiers are saints. The military is the moral authority. Discipline becomes a social code, order becomes sacred, and dying for the nation becomes the highest form of existence. You don't live to live, you live to die correctly. From Sparta to Imperial Japan, from colonial Europe to modern superpowers, the logic is the same. War doesn't just protect values, it is the value. Courage means obedience. Honor means death. Victory means righteousness. And anyone who questions the glory of war is framed as a coward, a traitor, a weakness in the armor. Under militarism, everything gets absorbed into the language of combat. Politics becomes a struggle. Education becomes training. Citizens become troops. Enemies become less than human. This belief system thrives on binary thinking. Us versus them. Victory or surrender. Patriot or parasite. It simplifies the world into sides, and once you pick a side, you're expected to sacrifice everything for it. Even yourself. Militarism feeds on fear, but disguises it as strength. It tells people that vigilance is courage, that aggression is wisdom, that safety can only come from overwhelming force, and that anyone not willing to fight is putting everyone else at risk. You don't have to go to war to be shaped by this logic. In militaristic cultures, children are taught to salute before they're taught to question. Boys are praised for toughness. Girls are taught to support the mission. Violence becomes normalized in media, in language, in identity. Even morality becomes tactical. You're told to admire bravery, but only the kind that serves the state. You're told to value sacrifice, but only if it's for the flag. You're told to love peace, but only the peace that comes after domination. And in the end, you begin to see the world not as something to understand or nurture, but something to conquer. Philosopher Bertrand Russell warned that militarism, left unchecked, doesn't just end lives. It ends thought. It turns nations into machines, people into weapons, and war itself into a purpose, not a means. Because once war becomes identity, peace starts to feel meaningless. And meaning, once fused with violence, becomes very hard to undo. Anthropocentrism. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. If every mosquito on Earth died tomorrow, would you care? Now try this. What if all dogs died, or all whales, or all bees? At some point, the emotional tone shifts. We begin to mourn. We begin to imagine meaning. But there's a threshold we rarely cross, the moment we ask, what if the world is not actually about us? Anthropocentrism, the belief that human beings are the center, the peak, the purpose, is one of the most ancient, deeply embedded, and dangerous belief systems in history. It's not always taught directly. It doesn't need to be. It's in our religions, our stories, our laws, our instincts. From Genesis to Google, the world is something we believe we are entitled to shape or ruin in our image. It starts innocently. You grow up hearing that humans are higher animals, that we are intelligent, rational, moral, that we have language, tools, gods, that we name the animals, that the earth is our domain. But the moment you believe the earth is for you, you justify almost anything done to it. Let's begin with a forest. In 1986, the Brazilian government declared parts of the Amazon suitable for cattle grazing. Within just a few years, millions of acres were burned. The reason? Economic development. But the philosophy underneath was even older. Trees don't cry, rivers don't scream, frogs don't protest, so they don't matter. What matters is the human need. Anthropocentrism doesn't require hatred, just disregard. It's what allowed the British Empire to build railroads through sacred indigenous lands. It's what let oil companies bury toxic waste in African villages. It's why we create machines that kill the insects we find inconvenient, while never asking what happens when the pollinators vanish. There's a quiet horror in that word, inconvenient. Do you know about the passenger pigeon? It used to be the most abundant bird in North America. Billions of them darkened the sky. They were so plentiful, people said a flock could blot out the sun. Then they were declared a nuisance. They interfered with farming. By 1914, the last passenger pigeon died in captivity. Her name was Martha. She died in a zoo, alone. All because we believe that if it doesn't serve us, it doesn't deserve to live. Philosophically, this belief goes all the way back to Aristotle. He described a hierarchy of being, rocks at the bottom, then plants, then animals, then humans at the top, because we alone have rational souls. That hierarchy survived through Aquinas, through Descartes, through the Enlightenment. Even Darwin, despite revolutionizing biology, described other animals as lower. We didn't really question our place, we just renamed our throne. It gets worse when you add religion. In Genesis, man is told to have dominion over the earth. Dominion, not coexistence. And throughout centuries of Christian theology, this idea was reinforced. The world was a gift, a testing ground, a disposable backdrop. Nature was something to be tamed, used, or transcended. So when colonists slaughtered entire buffalo herds just for sport, when mining companies turned mountains into gravel, when entire species disappeared because they stood in the way of development, none of it felt like evil. It felt like progress. Here's something darker. The logic of anthropocentrism doesn't stop at animals. It extends to humans too. Once you believe some lives are more human than others, the same machinery turns inward. That's how slavery was justified. Africans were seen as subhuman. That's how the Holocaust was carried out. Jews, Roma, and disabled people were declared biologically inferior. That's how factory workers today in Bangladesh or Vietnam are still treated, as less than real, because they live far away from the Western consumer. Anthropocentrism becomes egocentrism. It becomes the belief that I, or my people, or my kind, are the real humans. The rest are background noise. This same logic shows up in our climate collapse. We build cities on sinking coasts. We burn forests to plant soy. We pump carbon into the sky, knowing full well what it will do. But the worst part isn't that we're blind. It's that we believe deep down that even if the earth dies, it will die in service to us. As if that's somehow noble. That belief is not noble. It is delusion. And we've dressed it up with words like innovation, civilization, modernity. We've convinced ourselves that an iPhone is more valuable than a coral reef, that a mall is more meaningful than a wetland, that we are the only beings worth saving. But the earth will not argue. It doesn't need to. When the bees vanish, when the oceans acidify, when the air turns thick, it won't be about revenge. It will be about cause and effect. About a belief system collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. Maybe the truth is this: the world never belonged to us. We belong to it. Briefly. And maybe the most dangerous belief is the one so obvious, you never thought to question it. Welcome to the center of everything, where the end begins. Historical teleology, there's a comforting lie we tell ourselves. That history is a story, that it's going somewhere, that it's building towards something, freedom, equality, peace, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, that every atrocity is just a necessary step toward enlightenment. This belief has a name: historical teleology, the idea that history has a built-in purpose and that purpose is moral progress. It's how we sleep at night. We look at the past, slavery, war, genocide, and tell ourselves we're better now. It was awful, but it had to happen. We've evolved. We've moved forward. We think of ourselves as the enlightened chapter at the end of a long barbaric book. But what if the story never had a plot? What if history doesn't care what you think? Let's rewind. The 19th century was soaked in teleological thinking. Philosophers like Hegel believed that the world spirit, the Geist, was unfolding through time, gradually realizing itself through human freedom. Every war, every revolution, every blood-soaked upheaval was seen as part of some divine logic of progress. Even Napoleon's conquests were called the locomotive of history. Marx took the idea and turned it into economics. He argued that history had stages: feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and that history was guaranteed to end in classless utopia. It wasn't a hope, it was a law. Scientific. The problem: when you think history is supposed to go somewhere, you start justifying whatever gets you there. Lenin believed that the suffering of millions was acceptable because it was for the revolution. Now erased entire generations to move China past its feudal phase. Pol Pot murdered intellectuals, to return Cambodia to year zero, all because the story had to move forward. Teleology doesn't just make people hopeful, it makes them dangerous. And it never really left. Western liberalism picked it up too. After World War II, after the Cold War, Western thinkers like Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history, claiming that liberal democracy had won, that we'd finally reached the final chapter, that the world would gradually converge on freedom, markets, and human rights. How's that going? The 21st century gave us surveillance capitalism, refugee camps, algorithmic radicalization, and billionaires with doomsday bunkers. Progress? Or just another costume? Here's the real problem. Teleology is a narcotic. It makes you stop asking questions. It tells you that suffering has purpose, that injustice is just a phase, that the system will correct itself. It teaches you to wait, to believe that your children will fix it, or your grandchildren. It teaches you that morality is automatic. But morality isn't automatic. It's effort, constant, excruciating effort. Look at climate change. We knew about it in the 1950s. We had the science in the 70s, but we kept burning. Why? Because we believed we were progressing, innovating, evolving. Technology will fix it. History bends towards sustainability, right? The truth is, nothing bends unless we bend it. History doesn't care what you believe. It isn't a character. It isn't a force, it's just what people do, or fail to do, repeated at scale. Think of how slavery ended. It wasn't because history wanted it to. It was because people, humans, not timelines, fought, bled, revolted, resisted, and died. It ended not because of the arc of the universe, but because someone broke the arc. When we look at the past and say, well, they didn't know better, we forget something. There were always people who knew better, they just weren't listened to. The idea that everyone was blind until some enlightenment switch flipped is a lie told by winners, by the people who wrote the books, built the statues, signed the treaties. We see history as a staircase. In reality, it's a minefield. Some make it through, most don't. And no one lays the path except us. And the scariest part? When people believe history has an endpoint, they stop noticing when it repeats. That's how fascism rises again, dressed in new colors. That's how eugenics comes back as bioenhancement. That's how censorship comes back as content moderation. That's how child labor returns in the form of overseas factories. Different names, same horrors. Because the belief in historical progress creates blindness, we assume we've already overcome the darkness, so we don't see it when it comes back. So let's ask the hard question. What if we're not heading anywhere? What if history is just entropy, just noise, just humans doing what humans do, lying, loving, building, destroying, until one day the lights go out? Does that make the suffering meaningless, or does it make resistance even more sacred? Because if there's no destination, then every moment is the only chance you get. Maybe that's the real horror, and maybe that's the only freedom. Blank slate humanism. There's a beautiful idea, almost holy in modern culture, that every person is born as a blank slate. No instincts, no inner darkness, just infinite potential waiting to be shaped by kindness, education, and environment. You are not a beast. You are a soft, clean canvas. This is blank slate humanism, the belief that human nature is infinitely malleable and that everything wrong with people comes from society, not from within. Fix the environment, and you fix the person. Eliminate poverty, trauma, bad education, and what's left is peace. It sounds humane. It just happens to be wrong. And the consequences of believing it have been catastrophic. Let's rewind. In the 18th century, philosopher John Locke famously described the human mind at birth as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. No inborn ideas, no innate morality, just pure receptivity. This idea caught fire. It suggested that education could cure ignorance. That crime was a social failure, not a personal one. That people weren't bad. They were misprogrammed. But as it spread, it fused with Enlightenment optimism. It became more than psychology. It became ideology. By the 20th century, it wasn't just that people could learn anything. It was that anyone could become anything, if only we built the right system. Communism seized this belief. If people steal, it's because of capitalism. If people betray each other, it's because of private property. Human selfishness wasn't natural. It was imposed by economic structure, so change the structure and you create a new man. The new Soviet man wasn't a metaphor. He was an official psychological ideal, a human remade without greed, selfishness, or ambition. Entire generations were subjected to propaganda, re-education, and labor camp rehabilitation, not just to obey, but to change what they were. Thousands were killed, not because they acted wrongly, but because their class background suggested they would. Because if people are infinitely moldable, then they are infinitely punishable. Mao's China followed suit. The Cultural Revolution didn't just destroy institutions, it targeted personality, teachers, intellectuals, traditionalists. Anyone suspected of bourgeois thinking were humiliated, tortured, and re-educated. The goal wasn't punishment, it was purification. The wrong mind had to be erased. But it goes deeper than politics. Even in parenting, blank slate humanism did damage. Mid-20th century child psychologists like John Watson, the founder of Behaviorism, insisted that all behavior is learned. Affection was discouraged. Crying should be ignored. Because love wasn't a need, it was conditioning. Your child wasn't a soul, it was a lab animal waiting for inputs. He famously said, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select." What happened? A generation of emotionally starved children, attachment disorders, emotional illiteracy. And when those children failed to thrive, society blamed parents for not using the right script, because the belief stayed, if you didn't turn out perfect, someone must have raised you wrong. But the worst part is this. Blank slate humanism made people believe that suffering was always unnatural, that pain meant failure, that mental illness meant miseducation, that any flaw could be fixed with the right method, therapy, ideology, or love. This is cruelty dressed as compassion. Because if you think people are blank slates, then anyone still struggling must simply not be trying hard enough. The depressed person should just change their mindset. The addict should just reprogram their habits. The traumatized person should let go of the past. Because if you were truly blank and still turned out broken, what does that say about you? This belief isolates. Because it turns every inner struggle into a personal flaw, and every resistance to improvement into a moral failure. You weren't born with demons, you created them. So now it's your job to fix them. But real human nature is not a blank canvas. It's a chaotic battleground with instinct, contradiction, selfishness, tribalism, empathy, cruelty, all built in. Neuroscience proves it. Evolution demands it. Infants show preference for in-group faces before they can speak. Toddlers show possessiveness even before they're taught to share. And here's the paradox. Denying this truth, pretending we're blank, doesn't liberate us. It enslaves us to unrealistic ideals. We keep trying to become something we were never designed to be. We build schools, systems, and selves on fantasies, and then we wonder why they collapse. Blank slate humanism creates false hope and then blames you for breaking it. But more dangerously, it gives power to anyone who claims to have the right blueprint. Because if human beings are infinitely moldable, then whoever controls the environment, the education, the information, controls the soul. It justifies mass indoctrination, institutional engineering, surveillance, censorship, all for your benefit. You aren't being oppressed. You're being improved. That's how totalitarianism hides in kindness. The road to re-education is paved with good intentions. Esoteric elitism. There's a certain kind of belief that doesn't scream in the streets. It whispers behind velvet curtains, not in the public square but in private libraries, occult orders, ivory towers, and encrypted forums. It's the belief that truth is real, powerful, transformative truth, but you don't get to have it. You haven't earned it. Esoteric elitism is the belief that knowledge is not a human right, it's a privilege, and that the most important truths should be hidden from the masses because most people are too ignorant, too emotional, or too morally weak to handle them. It's a belief system that builds entire hierarchies, not of wealth, not of power, but of knowing. And it has shaped some of the most dangerous movements in history. Let's go back to the ancient mystery cults, from the Eleusinian rites of Greece to the secret initiations of Egypt. Knowledge wasn't taught, it was earned through ritual, obedience, and loyalty. Truth was encrypted in symbols, metaphors, and riddles. You couldn't speak it, only hint at it, and if you leaked it, you died. Because sacred knowledge was power, and power had to be protected. Fast forward to the Gnostics. They believed that most of humanity was trapped in illusion and that only a rare few possessed the divine spark to see through the lie. Salvation came not from faith, but from secret knowledge, gnosis, which only a spiritual elite could grasp. To the Gnostic, the material world was a prison, the creator a false god, and the path to liberation available only to those enlightened enough to decode the signs. This belief didn't die, it just changed outfits. Look at how modern totalitarian systems operate, especially those built on ideology. The inner party always knows something the outer party doesn't. Propaganda is for the masses. Doctrine is for the loyal. But truth, the real mechanics, the actual decisions, the philosophical foundations, that's reserved for the inner circle. The elite few who understand. Even today, you see it in conspiracy movements. QAnon followers were told to do the research, but only some research, only the right kind. The belief is, if you're smart enough, you'll see it. If not, you're just another sheep. It flatters the ego, and it isolates people from each other. That's the point. Esoteric elitism turns knowledge into a class system, and it thrives on exclusion. Language becomes gatekeeping. Complexity becomes a wall. Truth is layered, hierarchical, and each level requires more sacrifice to enter. This happens in academia too. Jargon becomes armor. Theory becomes a test of obedience. Philosophers like Hegel or Derrida are sometimes written in such dense, opaque language that understanding them feels less like enlightenment and more like passing an initiation rite. You perform intelligence to gain access to circles where meaning is hoarded, not shared. Even in spirituality, you see this. New Age gurus preach about higher vibrations, soul contracts, fifth-dimensional consciousness, but only if you buy the full course. True understanding, they imply, isn't something you can reach, it's something you can buy. Esoteric elitism gets monetized. At its core, this belief system assumes a deep contempt for the average human being. Because if you believe that truth is dangerous in the wrong hands, then you begin to believe that most people should never be trusted with it. This leads to systems of control that justify deception for your own good. Governments lie to preserve stability. Religions simplify to protect the faithful. Movements sanitize their goals to avoid scaring people and the elite. They justify it all by claiming the people couldn't handle the full picture anyway. The philosopher Leo Strauss was accused of promoting this. He suggested that great philosophers of the past wrote with esoteric layers, meaning they said one thing on the surface and another thing entirely between the lines. Because if they said the truth plainly, they'd be misunderstood, punished, or worse, they'd unleash something dangerous. It's a sobering idea that the most important truths about existence, power, freedom have never been spoken plainly, that they've been encoded, buried, encrypted in texts, rituals, or art, and that unless you belong to the chosen few who can interpret them, you'll never truly know what's going on. And worse, maybe you were never meant to. This belief system feeds both tyranny and delusion. Tyrants use it to hoard control. Cult leaders use it to seduce followers. But lonely, intelligent people also use it to comfort themselves. The world doesn't make sense because it's hiding something. I feel alienated because I'm one of the few who sees. It can feel empowering even as it isolates you completely. Esoteric elitism is intoxicating because it offers an identity. I am not like the others, but it also creates paranoia. Who else knows? Who's hiding what? And it's not always false. There are secrets. There is manipulation. There are truths we're not told. But the danger comes when that becomes a worldview, when you stop believing in shared knowledge, shared humanity, or shared reality. When you believe that most people are sheep and that the only people who matter are the ones enlightened enough to see through. That's when society fragments into cults of personality, into conspiracy echo chambers, into technocracies of cold contempt. That's when every conversation becomes a test, every disagreement becomes proof of inferiority, and every truth becomes yours to protect from the undeserving world. That's when you stop being human and become a priest of silence. Moral aestheticism. Imagine a world where the most elegant idea wins. Not the most ethical, not the most effective, the most aesthetically pleasing, the cleanest, the most poetic, the most symmetrical. The kind of idea that feels true, not because it is, but because it looks right in your head. That's moral aestheticism, the belief, often unspoken, that what is morally good must also be aesthetically pleasing. That beauty is a proxy for truth. That moral order should be graceful, proportioned, neat, like architecture. And that anything grotesque, messy, or emotionally jarring must also be ethically wrong. You've seen it before. In the slogan, "Order is virtue." In the quiet disgust aimed at the ugly, the deformed, the chaotic, the mentally ill. In the preference for philosophical theories that wrap up nicely, even when reality is murkier. In the worship of symmetry in moral systems, an eye for an eye, a life for a life, balance in the scales. It's seductive and dangerous. Let's start with the Nazis, because they understood moral aestheticism better than anyone. The Nazi ideology wasn't just about race or politics, it was about designing a world. They curated music, art, uniforms, landscapes. The SS insignia was modeled after runes. Their architecture mimicked Greco-Roman perfection. Hitler himself was obsessed with art. He saw himself as an aesthetic visionary. He believed that the world could be purified, made beautiful, by removing that which was ugly, the sick, the disabled, the non-Aryan. They called it cleansing, not extermination. Cleansing, because it felt clean. That's what makes it so horrifying. The Holocaust was justified not only by pseudoscience, but by aesthetic reasoning. They wanted a world that looked pure, sounded pure, marched in rhythm, followed rules. The existence of the deformed, the unpredictable, the other, that disrupted the moral geometry. They weren't just killing people, they were redrawing reality. But it's not just history. In philosophy, systems like Kantian deontology thrive because they offer elegant rules, never lie, always treat others as ends. It's neat, categorical, universal. It feels right. But real life, it's a swamp of exceptions. Lying to save a life, stealing to survive. Moral aestheticism despises this. It prefers the system over the soul. Even modern activism isn't immune. The aesthetics of protest, slogans, hashtags, even the appearance of the speaker affect who gets heard. People instinctively prefer activists who look the part, who are articulate, symmetrical, emotionally composed, not messy, disfigured, grieving. There's a bias toward moral narratives that can be easily filmed, shared, memed. The ugly truth often dies in the shadows because it lacks aesthetic viability. You see it in criminal justice, too. Photogenic defendants receive more sympathy. Beautiful victims get more media coverage. Ugliness becomes subconsciously linked to guilt. Even when people deny it consciously, court records show the correlation. Sentences are lighter for those who are conventionally attractive. That's not justice. That's aesthetic projection. Moral aestheticism whispers, if it feels ugly, it must be wrong. And that's how we start killing truths. Think about dystopias. They're always portrayed as visually bleak, right? Gray, harsh, mechanical. Because ugliness signals wrongness. But what if the most dangerous moral systems are beautiful on the surface? Clean logos, inspirational quotes, uplifting music, perfect branding. North Korea has one of the most aesthetically coherent propaganda machines in history. Glorious murals, youth choirs, uniformity in color, movement, speech, it feels like a musical. Underneath it, mass starvation, re-education camps, surveillance, but it looks perfect, and that's the point. Even Silicon Valley moral ideology falls into this trap. The obsession with clean interfaces, sleek language, utopian branding, all of it masks the messy ethical wreckage underneath. Exploitation, mental health damage, monopoly. But the ideas feel beautiful. Connecting the world, optimizing the future. It feels good, until you look closer. Moral aestheticism teaches us to prefer the satisfying lie over the ugly truth. The neat narrative over the complex one. The smiling face over the truthful scream. But human morality isn't beautiful. It's messy, contradictory, grief-soaked. You save one person and let another die. You break promises to protect someone. You fail, and you don't know why. That's real ethics. And that's why the belief in beauty as virtue is so dangerous, because it seduces us into ignoring suffering that doesn't look good on a poster. It makes us blind to moral horror if it's dressed well. So the next time an idea makes you feel warm just because it sounds poetic or looks elegant, and ask yourself, do I believe this because it's right or because it's pretty? Because some of the most horrifying systems in history came wrapped in perfect symmetry. Cultural Revolution fought reform. Destroy the old, erase the self. Let's imagine you're 17. You've memorized your revolutionary slogans. You wear your red armband with pride. And you've just been told your mother is a bourgeois element. The schoolmaster hands you a choice: confess that your family has infected you with capitalist thought, or be expelled, investigated, maybe even imprisoned. You hesitate. And that's when the entire class stands up and begins chanting, "Down with the four olds, down with the four olds." That chant, those words, was the rhythm of a psychological purge, and you're not just a victim, you're expected to become its soldier. This was China, 1966. The Cultural Revolution, a state-sponsored campaign to erase the past, and with it the self. Chairman Mao didn't just want power. He wanted control over how people thought, so he labeled the past a disease. Old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas, they became enemies. The solution wasn't policy, it was re-education. Temples were destroyed, ancient books burned. Teachers were beaten by their own students in public struggle sessions. Children denounced parents, wives denounced husbands. Professors who had spent decades teaching were forced to wear dunce caps and confess fake crimes on stage, often weeping from shame, often bleeding from beatings. But this wasn't just physical violence, it was identity violence. You weren't just forced to say you were wrong, you had to believe it. And if you didn't, you were resistant to thought reform, a dangerous mind. So they isolated you, bombarded you with slogans, made you copy pages of Mao's little red book for 12 hours straight. The aim wasn't confession, it was erasure. Erase your memories, your loyalties, your inner voice, until all that was left was a state-shaped echo. One survivor later wrote, "I didn't know which memories were mine anymore. I began to believe I had always been wrong." That's the dark brilliance of thought reform. It doesn't just destroy your beliefs, it replaces them and convinces you they were always yours. Psychologists call this coercive persuasion. The strategic breakdown of identity followed by controlled reconstruction, and it works frighteningly well. In 1956, even before the Cultural Revolution, Chinese camps were already experimenting with revolutionary confession therapy. American prisoners of war in Korea were subjected to similar tactics: prolonged isolation, forced repetition, and constant moral degradation. Some came home convinced the U.S. was evil, not because they were brainwashed, but because their inner voice had been replaced. This kind of identity engineering didn't end in China. You'll find echoes of it in Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, where children were taught to kill anyone who remembered life before the revolution. You'll see it in North Korea, where toddlers are taught not just to obey, but to love the supreme leader more than their parents. And you'll even see traces of it in modern ideological echo chambers, where dissent isn't debated, it's purged, where only total conformity counts as virtue, where the past must be destroyed to make way for pure belief. Because the logic of thought reform is always the same: destroy the old, erase the self. Build a human mind that belongs to the state, and once someone believes that their own thoughts are untrustworthy, once they no longer remember who they were before the slogans, they don't need chains anymore. They'll police themselves. State atheism, when all belief becomes illegal. You're kneeling in your room, not loudly, not in public, just quietly, praying. But in the eyes of the state, that's treason. Because in a system built on state atheism, God isn't just dead, he's outlawed. And you're a criminal, not for action, but for belief. This is what happens when the government decides that all metaphysics is a virus. That belief itself is an infection that must be eliminated, not with arguments, but with force. Let's take you to Albania in the 1960s, a small nation under a brutal communist regime led by Enver Hoxha, and the first country in the world to constitutionally ban all religion. Churches dynamited, mosques converted into gyms and armories, clergy imprisoned, tortured, or simply vanished. A child caught wearing a crucifix could be expelled. A grandmother whispering verses from the Quran. That was sedition. And the government's logic was chillingly simple. Religion breeds division. The party is unity. Faith is fiction. Science is truth. Worship of gods is backward. Worship of the state is progress. This wasn't unique. In Stalin's USSR, the League of the Militant Godless was founded to eliminate religion through mockery, violence, and humiliation. Orthodox priests were dragged into streets, dressed in clown robes, forced to dance before execution. Icons were desecrated. Pilgrims shot. Bibles burned. Temples demolished and replaced with statues of Lenin, but the real destruction was invisible. It was in the psyche, in the creation of a moral vacuum. You see, when all belief is outlawed, nothing is sacred except the regime. You don't get to question the system because the system replaces God. The party decides what's true. The leader decides what's good. And there is no higher appeal. You can't say, but this feels wrong. Because feelings are superstition. You can't say, but God sees, because God has been executed, and without belief, there's no outside point of reference. No divine justice, no sacred dignity, only obedience. Only utility. The result? A generation raised to distrust not just each other but their own conscience. Philosopher Leszek Kołakowski, once a Marxist himself, warned of this. When you destroy God, you do not erase sin, you erase mercy. Without a transcendent anchor, morality becomes whatever those in power decide today, and tomorrow it might change. This isn't to say belief systems are always benevolent. History is full of religious violence, but state atheism isn't neutrality, it's replacement. It turns the absence of God into a weapon, not a freedom. You're no longer free from religion. You're required to submit to disbelief, state-sanctioned, enforced disbelief. Belief becomes a security risk, a disloyal mind, an enemy within. And so the regime doesn't stop at burning holy books. It burns hope. It burns forgiveness. It burns the inner world where resistance might live. Because the most dangerous idea in a totalitarian system is the idea that something higher than the state might exist, that you might bow your head, not to a flag, not to a general, not to the economy, but to something they can't control, and that cannot be tolerated. So they erase belief, not to free you, but to own you completely. Original sin and inherited guilt. You were born wrong before you spoke a word, before you made a choice, before you knew what right or wrong even meant. You were already guilty. That's the core of original sin, the belief that all humans are born carrying the guilt of someone else's crime, specifically the first humans, the ones who disobeyed God, who ate from the tree, who fell. And from that fall, so the story goes, you fell too. Not by action, not by thought, by inheritance. In Christian theology, original sin explains why the world is broken, why humans suffer, why death exists. It creates the problem for which salvation is the answer. You are born already stained, and only through divine grace can you be made clean. But let's pause here. Because this idea doesn't just explain suffering, it blames you for it. Before you make a moral choice, you are condemned. Before you understand what disobedience is, you are told you've already disobeyed. And once that belief takes hold, guilt becomes your foundation. This isn't a fringe doctrine. It shaped the psychology of entire civilizations. Medieval Europe was built on it. Children were taught that even their desires were sinful, that their flesh was corrupt, that their existence was a problem to be solved. Infant baptism wasn't just a ritual, it was an emergency procedure. A newborn who died without it was believed to face eternal punishment for being born. And from that guilt came control. If you're already guilty, then authority has the right to correct you. If you're already fallen, then suffering becomes your purification. If you question, you're rebellious. If you accept, you're humble. The same logic has echoed far beyond religion. Inherited guilt shows up in social hierarchies, where your birth determines your moral status. In caste systems where being born into a lower group isn't just unfortunate, it's seen as a reflection of your soul. In racial ideologies, where bloodlines are labeled as cursed or tainted, and entire peoples are blamed for ancient crimes. In family structures where trauma is passed down as debt, and children grow up feeling responsible for pain they never caused. This is the cruelty of inherited guilt. It destroys agency from the start. You're not taught to take responsibility for your choices. You're taught that your very existence is already a mistake. And once guilt becomes your baseline, punishment becomes love. You're punished by your parents because they care. You're punished by your church because they want to save you. You're punished by your culture because you need to be shaped. The beatings, the shame, the silence, they're not seen as violence. They're framed as redemption. Even in secular spaces, the residue of this belief remains. People feel shame for feeling joy. They apologize for taking up space. They distrust pleasure. They assume that if something good happens, they probably don't deserve it, because somewhere deep in the foundation, they were told they were wrong by default. Original sin isn't just a theological doctrine, it's a psychological mold. And once you're poured into it, everything else, your dreams, your desires, your identity, is shaped around the belief that you started broken. Loyalty as the highest virtue, betrayal becomes worse than murder. What if I told you that in some systems, loyalty is worth more than truth, more than law, more than life? You could kill, you could torture. You could lie under oath, burn down villages, destroy families, and still be a hero, so long as you were loyal, but betray your side? Tell the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Help the wrong person. Now you're the monster, because once loyalty becomes the highest moral good, betrayal becomes the ultimate sin. Even if it's done to save lives, even if it's done to protect the innocent, it doesn't matter why you crossed the line. Only that you crossed it. This is why authoritarian regimes thrive on purges, not to eliminate actual threats, but to terrify everyone into unconditional loyalty. In Stalin's Soviet Union, friends denounced friends, spouses turned each other in, children informed on their parents, all to prove their loyalty to the party. Why? Because staying silent might look suspicious. Too much empathy might signal weakness, and no one wants to be accused of sympathizing with enemies of the people. In North Korea, loyalty is monitored generationally. If your grandfather defected, you'll still live in a lower caste. Your children, too. Your blood is guilty. It doesn't matter who you are. It matters who you were loyal to. Think of the ancient Spartan system. Their greatest crime wasn't cowardice. It was disloyalty to the state, to the group. They trained boys to kill and steal, but only punished them if they got caught. Because being caught brought dishonor, it made the group look weak. Even in modern times, you can see this logic in cults, extremist political movements, toxic corporate cultures. Leave the group, you're a traitor. You were never really one of us. And the deeper the group's ideology, the harsher the punishment for disloyalty. Here's where it gets disturbing. The more irrational the system becomes, the more loyalty is demanded. Because truth becomes dangerous. Logic becomes dangerous. Conscience becomes dangerous. And so, loyalty becomes survival. In these systems, moral worth isn't judged by what you do, but by who you serve. Kill for the right cause. You're a patriot. Expose a crime by your own side. You're a traitor. Even if your act was just, even if your conscience was clear. And when that mindset infects a society, the result is chilling. You end up with people who would rather watch a friend die than betray the group. Doctors who cover up medical abuses, soldiers who follow illegal orders, citizens who see a man beaten in the street and look away. Because the one thing worse than evil in those systems is betrayal. And this isn't just political. It happens in families. The abused child who keeps quiet to protect the abuser. The whistleblower fired from the company they helped. The friend exiled from the group chat for saying what everyone else was too scared to admit. We're social creatures. And in the wrong hands, our need to belong becomes a weapon. Loyalty can be beautiful, but when it becomes a religion, truth dies. And morality becomes a team sport. Security above all, the state becomes a paranoid god. It always begins with a promise. A bomb went off in the capital. A plane never reached its destination. A child disappeared. A virus spread faster than speech. The people panic, and the state leans forward and whispers, "We will keep you safe, but there's a cost." Because when security becomes the highest value, higher than freedom, higher than truth, higher than dignity, you don't live in a country anymore. You live in a nervous system. And the state is the brain. You're a nerve ending, sensitive, replaceable, monitored for malfunction. Let's start with something seemingly ancient, the USA Patriot Act. After 9/11, the United States passed laws that allowed unprecedented surveillance powers. Phone calls, emails, bank records, all monitored. Warrants became optional. Due process, a suggestion. The justification, terror. Who would defend the rights of a bomber? Who needs privacy if they've done nothing wrong? But ask yourself this. When was the last time a government gave back powers it seized during a crisis? The surveillance stayed, the fear stayed, and slowly, freedom became the thing you give up to prove you're a good citizen. This is the logic of every regime that becomes paranoid. In East Germany, the Stasi had informants in every apartment block. People were recruited to spy on friends, lovers, even their own parents. Imagine never speaking freely, not in your kitchen, not in your dreams, because the walls themselves were ears. In China, the social credit system tracks everything from your shopping habits to your online posts. Jaywalk too often, your score drops. Speak against the government, you're banned from trains, planes, maybe even jobs, and it's justified. For your safety, for social harmony, for stability. But stability has a dark flip side, paranoia, because if safety is everything, then risk is evil. And if risk is evil, then independence is threat. A journalist becomes a subversive, a protester, a terrorist. A curious question becomes sedition. This is how regimes build obedience from fear, by declaring the world too dangerous for freedom. They say, "We'll protect you from enemies if you let us treat you like one," and you agree. You stop talking to strangers. You report your neighbor. You teach your child not to ask why. Because in a paranoid system, even innocence is suspicious. The philosopher Giorgio Agamben described this as the state of exception, a moment when emergency suspends law and never ends. You live in a constant temporary crisis. The rules don't apply anymore, and no one tells you when or if they ever will again. This is the final stage. The state becomes a god, but not a merciful one, not a wise one. A nervous, panicked, trembling God, watching everyone, suspecting everything, forgiving nothing. And you are kept alive, not because you are free, but because you are contained. You don't get freedom in a paranoid God's kingdom. You get tolerance. As long as you behave. Caste systems as divine will. Your role is sacred and fixed. Some belief systems don't just tolerate inequality, they call it holy. Caste isn't just a social hierarchy. It's a belief that your worth, your purity, your very soul is determined before you're born. Not by chance, not by merit, but by divine order. And once you believe that, the system becomes more than unfair. It becomes untouchable. Let's begin where this logic took its most enduring form: India. For over 2,000 years, Hindu society was structured into four main varnas: priest, warrior, merchant, servant. But outside this pyramid, below it, were the Dalits, the untouchables. The ones whose touch, whose shadow, whose presence was believed to pollute those above. A Dalit child couldn't drink from the same well, couldn't enter the same temple, couldn't walk on the same side of the road in many villages, and if they tried, they were beaten, stripped, lynched. This wasn't just enforced by cruelty, it was enforced by belief. Sacred texts, like the Manusmriti, described detailed punishments for lower castes who dared to read or even hear sacred scripture. In some interpretations, molten lead was to be poured in their ears if they overheard a verse. This wasn't personal prejudice, this was religious order, and that's what made it so unbreakable. Because when a hierarchy is framed as divine, fighting it isn't just rebellion, it's blasphemy. Now imagine growing up inside this system. Imagine being told that your suffering isn't the result of injustice, it's the karma of your past life that you are meant to serve, that your silence is sacred, that your body, your voice, your name all belong to a lower realm of existence. And even if you resist, you're resisting the will of the universe. This logic didn't vanish with colonization. Under British rule, the caste system was documented, formalized, and in some ways hardened, turned into administrative categories. A spiritual order became a bureaucratic reality. And even today, despite legal protections, Dalits face daily violence. There are still villages where Dalit children are made to sit at the back of classrooms. Still jobs they're expected to do, cleaning sewers, handling corpses, sweeping human waste, because others believe that's their place, not just socially, but spiritually. This idea that some people are meant to be below has echoes far beyond India. In feudal Europe, the idea of the divine right of kings said that nobility was chosen by God. In racial slavery, black Africans were portrayed as cursed descendants of Ham, a biblical distortion used to justify bondage. In segregationist America, white supremacy was preached from church pulpits, not as hatred but as divine design. Every system had the same message: you are what you are, because the heavens willed it, and any attempt to change that, it's unnatural, dangerous, ungrateful. Even in modern times, you can still hear remnants of this belief. When poor communities are told to stay in their lane. When entire ethnic groups are framed as culturally inferior. When immigrants are treated as eternal outsiders, no matter how long they've lived in a place. When social mobility is treated not as a right, but as a gift granted to the few who behave. It's caste by another name. The cruelty of caste isn't just the pain it causes, it's the peace it pretends to create, because to those at the top, the system feels stable, natural, ordered. To question it feels like inviting chaos. So instead they call it sacred. But sacred doesn't mean good. And when oppression is declared holy, there is no limit to how long it can last. Theocracy. God is the head of state. You're accused of blasphemy. There was no trial. Your accuser is anonymous. Your crime. Doubting the regime's interpretation of God. You try to protest, but it doesn't matter. You're not being judged by a man. You're being judged by a man who believes he speaks for God. That's the machinery of a theocracy. It's not just a government run by priests. It's a state where questioning authority is the same as sin. Where dissent becomes heresy, and the courtroom becomes a pulpit. You think of Iran in 1988. Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa, a religious edict, ordering the mass execution of political prisoners. Thousands were hanged in secret. Their crime? Being enemies of God. Some had merely written leftist pamphlets. Others had been arrested as teenagers and never released. No appeals. No explanations. Because when the law is divine, it cannot be wrong. But this isn't just a story about Islam. Look at Europe. In 1619, a Czech philosopher named Kazimierz Wyszyński was executed in Warsaw for atheism. He had written that God was a human invention. The church found his manuscript, dragged him through the streets, cut out his tongue, and burned him alive. In Calvinist Geneva, you could be put to death for missing church. Michael Servetus, a brilliant thinker who denied the Trinity, was burned at the stake by John Calvin himself while still alive. In Puritan New England, women were accused of witchcraft by teenage girls, then crushed with stones or hanged because God was said to be angry. In each case, the state didn't need evidence. It had faith. That's what makes theocracy so terrifying. Other regimes might kill you for what you do. Theocracy kills you for what you believe or what you don't, and it's always justified because the authority isn't human anymore. It's divine. If you disagree, you're not a political opponent. You're evil, and evil doesn't deserve rights. Evil deserves cleansing. It's why Saudi Arabia bans women from dressing freely, driving, or even walking alone, because the law is Sharia, and Sharia is claimed to come from God. It's why LGBTQ+ people in Uganda, Iran, or Brunei can be executed, not because they harmed anyone, but because the scriptures say so. Theocracy turns morality into obedience. Virtue becomes submission, and salvation becomes state policy. But here's the twist that should keep you up tonight. Even secular countries can slip into theocratic logic. Every time a politician says God is on our side, every time a policy is justified with scripture instead of reason, every time morality is legislated by religious fear rather than ethical reasoning, a piece of theocracy grows back, because the power of theocracy isn't in robes or crosses or mosques. It's in the idea that some humans speak for the absolute. And once you believe that, they can do anything. Hyper-capitalism. Everything has a price, including you. There's a silent transaction behind almost every moment of your life. You just don't see the receipt. You post a thought and sell your attention. You apply for a job and sell your time. You date someone new and sell a version of yourself. And in the logic of hyper-capitalism, if it doesn't generate profit, it doesn't exist. This belief system goes beyond markets or free trade. It's the idea that everything, identity, morality, human connection, can be reduced to price, and if it can't be monetized, it has no value. Let's be clear. Capitalism, in its basic form, is an economic system. Buy, sell, trade. Fine. But hyper-capitalism is something darker. It's when the market logic infects everything, including your soul. You don't have worth anymore. You must produce it. This started slowly. In the Industrial Revolution, workers sold their labor for survival. Time became a commodity. The clock replaced the sun. The factory replaced the village, and you weren't a human anymore. You were a worker unit. But that was just the beginning. In the 20th century, advertising learned a new trick. Don't just sell the product, sell the feeling. Want love? Buy perfume. Want power? Buy a car. Want peace? Buy a mattress. Soon, your emotions had price tags. Loneliness? There's an app for that. Insecurity? There's a supplement. Status anxiety? Try luxury. And now, in the 21st century, you've become the product. Your clicks, your scrolls, your data, your fears, harvested, analyzed, sold. You are the raw material. Your mind is the factory. Your attention is the currency. Social media platforms don't sell services. They sell you to advertisers. And the content you see is filtered, not by truth, but by what keeps you watching. Because in hyper-capitalism, engagement is everything. Truth is negotiable. Outrage is profitable. Your outrage is profitable. This mindset seeps into relationships. Dating becomes a market. Swipe left, swipe right. Each profile a miniature billboard. Love becomes performance. Authenticity becomes branding. Even kindness gets monetized. Volunteer work becomes resume filler. Altruism becomes content. Doing good becomes marketing strategy. The logic is everywhere. Education, pay to play. Healthcare, productized survival. Art, Value depends on whether it trends. Death, a $15,000 funeral industry designed to profit from your grief. And if you're struggling to survive in this system, it's your fault. That's the unspoken dogma of hyper-capitalism. If you can't compete, you don't deserve to exist. No time to grieve, no time to rest, no time to think. Only time to produce. Philosophically, this erases the intrinsic. Nothing is sacred, only useful. And if your usefulness runs out, so does your visibility. Think of the elderly in nursing homes who receive fewer visitors each year. Think of the disabled whose survival depends on GoFundMe campaigns. Think of the homeless whose lives are described as burdens on public space. In a world where everything must pay rent, people who can't generate profit are treated like waste. And you start to internalize it. You stop doing things for joy and start asking, can I monetize this? You start measuring your day by output. You start seeing rest as laziness. You start branding your pain. Even your personality becomes an asset to optimize. Hyper-capitalism teaches you this. If you can't extract value from yourself, someone else will. And the worst part, you'll thank them for it. Because they'll sell it back to you as freedom. Meritocracy myth. You deserve your failure. Let's say a child is born into a poor neighborhood. One parent, no safety net. The school has no funding, no books, and no windows that close properly. They work hard, they try, but they fall behind. Now let's say another child is born into wealth, private tutors, travel, elite schools, social capital, safety. Now skip forward 30 years. The second child is a CEO. The first is unemployed, and the world looks at that and says, one of them worked harder. That's the myth. Meritocracy sounds fair. It promises that talent, effort, and ability will rise to the top, and those who fail simply didn't try hard enough. But in practice, it's the perfect disguise for structural inequality. Because if success is based purely on merit, then failure must be your fault. Not the system, not the circumstances, not the inherited chains, just you. This belief system has a long, seductive history. In 1958, British sociologist Michael Young coined the term meritocracy in a satirical novel, warning of a dystopia where intelligence-based social sorting leads to a brutal class system. Ironically, the world embraced the term and ignored the warning. In the US, the idea of the American dream promised that anyone could rise. All you had to do was work harder. But this wasn't a promise, it was a defense mechanism. Because if the poor are lazy and the rich are deserving, then no one has to feel guilty. It gives the winners a way to look in the mirror and say, I earned this. And it gives the losers a reason to blame themselves. Meritocracy lets the elite sleep well. Because it erases luck, it erases privilege. It erases inherited trauma, racism, poverty, disability, mental illness, all of it flattened into a single moral judgment. You failed, so you must not have tried hard enough. But look closer. Do the hardest working people always succeed? Are billionaires really the smartest? Do minimum wage workers have less character? Or are we living in a system that worships outcomes and ignores everything that came before? In school systems, gifted children are often those who had early resources. In the workplace, promotions go to the socially connected, not the competent. In media, we celebrate the self-made, but never examine the invisible scaffolding. And when someone does succeed from humble origins, the system holds them up as a token, proof the system works. But for everyone's success story, there are thousands buried by bad luck, family tragedy, debt, or just being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. Meritocracy turns compassion into suspicion. If someone is struggling, we don't ask what happened, we ask what's wrong with them. It turns success into moral virtue and failure into moral decay. And once that logic takes hold, the system doesn't need to punish the poor. They'll punish themselves. They'll internalize the shame. They'll stop asking for help. They'll believe they deserve less. That's the brilliance of the myth. It doesn't just reward the winners, it justifies the suffering of everyone else. Because if you believe the game is fair, then every loss is proof that you were never good enough to play. Religious justifications for slavery. Your body belongs to your master by divine order. Some of the worst crimes in human history weren't just committed in silence, they were committed with scripture in hand. Slavery wasn't just tolerated by religious institutions, it was defended by them, rationalized, systematized, and declared the will of God. This is one of the darkest forms of belief, when domination is not only permitted, but presented as divine mercy. Let's begin with Christianity, specifically the transatlantic slave trade. From the 15th to the 19th century, over 12 million Africans were abducted, shackled, and transported across oceans like cargo. Entire cultures dismantled, families torn apart, bodies broken and sold. But European colonizers weren't just merchants, they were missionaries. Portuguese and Spanish conquerors carried crosses alongside whips. Slave ships were christened with names like Jesus and Grace of God. Enslaved people were baptized, not as liberation, but as ownership. To be saved, they were told they must first be enslaved. Christian theologians argued that slavery was part of the natural order, ordained since Genesis. The so-called curse of Ham became a favored justification, a twisted reading of the story in which Noah curses his son Ham's descendants, supposedly marking them as servants forever. This was interpreted to mean that Africans, believed by many Europeans to be Ham's lineage, were destined by God to serve. This wasn't fringe theology, it was mainstream. In the American South, pastors preached from pulpits that slavery was a positive good, that enslaved people were better off under Christian masters, that rebellion against slavery was rebellion against God's design. One Southern clergyman wrote in 1856, "God has made the Negro with a submissive mind and a strong body for labor. The Bible sanctions his servitude," and people believed it. But it wasn't just Christians. In the Islamic world, slavery existed for over 1,000 years. Across empires from Arabia to West Africa to South Asia, Quranic verses acknowledged the existence of slaves and regulated their treatment. While Islam encouraged manumission, freeing slaves as a moral act, it also accepted slavery as a fact of life, often framing it as a more humane alternative to execution in war. Many Islamic jurists classified slaves as property with partial legal personhood. Female slaves could be used for sexual purposes, considered lawful what your right hand possesses. And while slavery in Islamic contexts was not race-based in the same way as the Atlantic trade, it was still a system of hierarchy, coercion, and inherited bondage under religious law. Other traditions followed similar patterns. In ancient Hindu society, the Manusmriti described hierarchical roles for people, and while it didn't use the word slavery in the modern sense, lower castes were often forced into generational servitude. Their position was said to reflect karma, spiritual debt, cosmic justice. And once again, resistance to the system was framed not as liberation, but disobedience to divine law. This is the disturbing genius of religious justification. It doesn't just chain the body, it chains the soul. It tells the oppressed that their suffering is righteous, that their obedience is spiritual, that their silence is sacred. And it tells the oppressors that their dominance is not cruelty, but piety. Even after slavery was abolished in law, these beliefs lingered in culture. The idea that some people were born to serve, that submission is moral, that hierarchy is holy. It survives today in the way we talk about servant hearts, in spiritual teachings that glorify obedience and punishment, in the quiet persistence of systems that treat some humans as more disposable than others, but still wrap it in the language of tradition, order, or faith. Because when oppression wears a halo, the chains no longer need to be visible. Algorithmic truth. The feed is your God. You don't wake up and open your phone. You wake up into your phone. Before your brain even finishes booting, your thumb is already scrolling. News, opinions, jokes, death, beauty, disaster, betrayal, all flowing in the same feed, at the same speed, without context or hierarchy. It's not information. It's a ritual, and the algorithm is the priest. We like to think we live in an age of reason, science, facts, data. But most of your knowledge doesn't come from research or careful reading or thought. It comes from the feed, and the feed is not a neutral stream. It is a weaponized, self-learning reflection of what keeps you engaged, not informed. The more you click, the more it learns. The more it learns, the more it shapes what you believe. Until one day you're not thinking with the algorithm, you're thinking inside it. Let's be very clear. The algorithm doesn't care what's true. It cares what's addictive. And what's addictive? Fear, anger, conflict, confirmation. If a video tells you the world is ending, you'll watch to the end. If a headline makes you furious, you'll share it before you check it. If a post flatters your beliefs, you'll believe it more than your own memory. This is how truth gets outsourced. Not to experts, not to books. To code, opaque, privately owned, and trained on your own worst instincts. In 2016, a single rumor in India, spread through WhatsApp, led to a lynching. In Myanmar, Facebook's algorithm amplified hate speech that fueled genocide. In the US, conspiracies gained more traction than science because the algorithm made them viral. Not because people are stupid. Because people are predictable, and algorithms profit from prediction. Philosophically, this is a new kind of epistemology. The study of how we know what we know, replaced by engagement metrics. If it trends, it feels true. If it gets likes, it feels valid. If it repeats, it becomes memory. It's not what's real. It's what the machine says you'll respond to. And here's where it gets worse. You think you're choosing what to see, but your choices were already modeled. You think you're discovering information, but it was chosen for you. You think you're forming beliefs, but you're inheriting patterns of consumption. And those patterns, they're optimized for behavior, political views, buying habits, moral reactions, even dating preferences. All gently nudged, all invisibly sculpted. The feed doesn't show you the world. It creates the world you see, a world tailored to your triggers, which means we no longer argue from reality. We argue from different simulations. Each person stuck in their own carefully curated delusion. Each one sure they're the one who sees clearly. Each one yelling at shadows, trained to believe it's the other side that's brainwashed. But everyone is being shaped in real time by an invisible profit-driven machine. And worst of all, we trust it. More than we trust people. More than books. More than ourselves. The algorithm doesn't just feed you lies. It makes you love them because they feel like you. And when a machine learns how to mimic your preferences, it stops being a tool and becomes a mirror. But a mirror that doesn't reflect you. It creates you. One click at a time. Celebrity worship as moral compass. You see a man slap another man on live television. The world erupts. Some say it was brave. Others say it was vile. Articles explode. Podcasts debate morality. TikToks recreate it. The incident becomes the conversation, not just about two people, but about right and wrong, masculinity, violence, trauma, fame. In one moment, the world is morally recalibrated, not by philosophers or thinkers, but by an actor on a stage. This is the new moral compass, celebrity behavior as ethical scripture. We used to look to prophets, scholars, elders. Now we look to influencers, YouTubers, and movie stars. Their tweets are dissected like scripture. Their fashion becomes political. Their apologies are public rituals. Their choices define not just taste, but virtue, and most of them never asked for this role. But we gave it to them anyway. Because something in us needs figures to follow. Anthropologically, humans are tribal animals. We learn by watching high-status members of the group. This was once the village elder, the priest, the warrior. Now it's a person with a verified checkmark in brand partnerships. Because today, fame substitutes wisdom. It doesn't matter if they're educated, informed, or thoughtful. It matters if they're visible. It matters if their face fills your feed. And in that visibility, they become moral avatars. When a celebrity endorses a cause, it gains credibility. When they betray a value, it feels like a personal betrayal. That's not admiration. That's faith. We defend them. We cancel them. We resurrect them. We gossip like priests interpreting omens, and the system feeds it. Media doesn't just report, it monetizes this worship. Controversy becomes content. Redemption arcs become engagement funnels. Every misstep becomes a spectacle, and every spectacle becomes a lesson. But here's the problem. Celebrity morality is performance-based. It's curated, edited, stylized, and publicly optimized. Behind the scenes are teams of managers, PR strategists, and algorithms, all crafting an image to be consumed, which means we're being taught ethics by brands pretending to be people. When a celebrity learns and grows, we applaud. When they cry on camera, we feel catharsis. But none of it is about actual accountability. It's about perception management. And still, we internalize it. We mimic their language. We adopt their stances. We judge each other through the lens of parasocial morality. If your favorite celebrity supports a movement, you feel safe supporting it. If they're silent, you hesitate. If they're attacked, you defend, not because you know them, but because they've become a symbol of who you are. This is the psychological trap. We confuse identification with understanding, visibility with virtue, fame with truth. And in doing so, we outsource our moral thinking. But celebrities aren't gods. They're performers, often lost, often fragile, often broken in private. And we've turned them into mirrors, not of reality, but of our longing. Because deep down, we want someone to show us how to live, how to be good, how to matter. But the more we worship them, the more we lose our own compass, and the more we let the camera lens shape our ethics, the more our morality becomes a performance too. Smile, post, apologize, repeat. Not because it's right, but because they did it first.